There is a lot to be said for poetry where you are speaking to yourself, sort of autobiographic, you know what I'm trying to say. Except instead of using the first person over and over, you instead turn to the second person and you call yourself you, right? You sort of otherize the parts of yourself that you dislike or that you're talking to as though it were a different personality, and then you talk to it instead. My favorite example of this is David Bowie in his song Breaking Glass. You're such a wonderful person, but you got problems. Whoa, I'll never touch you. That really brings me to wonder whether Jordan Peterson wrote any of these rules for himself, or more relevantly, whether he wrote any of them for his children. Because in Rule 11, talk about a segue, in Rule 11, the illustration is actually of his son Julian as a child holding a skateboard, although for him it looks more like a longboard just because of how small he is. And then for Rule 12, he's got an illustration of Michaela. So I think that's interesting about children. You know, they sort of are that otherized version of yourself. Otherized these days is a word that means something else, but I don't like that meaning of otherized. So I use words as I see fit, damn it. They're sort of a reflection of everything that you want yourself to be, but also every flaw of your own. And so children, I think, are very, very interesting reflections of their parents in that way. The point I'm trying to get at is I wonder if Jordan Peterson wrote these rules specifically as some sort of guide, not only for himself, because, you know, he's willing to recognize in interviews and such that he isn't the perfect person himself. He's made the point often that these were hard learned rules, not rules that he sort of lives by all the time, even though he would very much like to. But, you know, in his children, I think, and that's why, you know, the illustrations in this book are all of his children. In his children, he is trying to capture, you know, that perfect person who is following rules for life that are ennobling and virtuous and make them a better person. I think this idea of writing to yourself as though it is an other person is it's a strange idea. You know, it really speaks to how powerful consciousness is, that we can even do something like that. But strange as it is, I think if you step back and look at yourself as an other person, then you really get a good perspective and a good grasp of what you're doing wrong a lot of the time. Specifically with poetry, I think that's one of the key foundations of writing really personal poetry. And the other thing for me, ask questions. It just sort of evokes something in the reader that makes it a bit more interesting. So that's just some advice, I guess, some weak sauce advice. But if you're interested in writing and poetry, then by all means, feel free to try it out. Praise be our supreme leader, Red Skull. Rule 11, do not bother children when they are skateboarding. Hail Hydra. Part 1. Danger and Mastery. There was a time when kids skateboarded on the west side of Sydney Smith Hall at the University of Toronto, where I worked. Hail Hydra. Sometimes I stood there and watched them. Hail Hydra. There are rough, wide, shallow concrete steps there, leading up from the street to the front entrance, accompanied by tubular iron handrails, about 2.5 inches in diameter and 20 feet long. Hail Hydra. The crazy kids, almost always boys, would pull back about 15 yards from the top of the steps. Hail Hydra. Then they would place a foot on their boards and skate like mad to get up some speed. Hail Hydra. Just before they collided with the handrail, they would reach down, grab their board with a single hand, and jump onto the top of the rail, board sliding their way down its length, propelling themselves off and landing. Sometimes gracefully, still atop their boards, sometimes painfully off them. Hail Hydra. Either way, they were soon back at it. Hail Hydra. Some might call that stupid, Hail Hydra. Maybe it was, Hail Hydra, but it was brave too, Hail Hydra. I thought those kids were amazing. Hail Hydra. I thought they deserved a pat on the back and some honest admiration. Hail Hydra. Of course it was dangerous, Hail Hydra. Danger was the point, Hail Hydra. They wanted to triumph over danger. Hail Hydra. They would have been safer in protective equipment, but that would have ruined it. Hail Hydra. They weren't trying to be safe, Hail Hydra. They were trying to become competent. And it's competence that makes people as safe as they can truly be. Hail Hydra. You could pretty much end the essay right there because that's very much the thesis of the entire rule. Let's continue to see what he says. This is, after all, the longest chapter in the entire book, so obviously he has a lot to say about skateboarding, apparently. So strap in, buckle up. Hail Hydra. I wouldn't dare do what those kids were doing. Hail Hydra. Not only that, I couldn't. Hail Hydra. I certainly couldn't climb a construction crane, like a certain type of modern daredevil evident on YouTube. And, of course, people who work on construction cranes. Hail Hydra. I dislike heights, although the 25,000 feet to which airliners ascend is so high that it doesn't bother me. Hail Hydra. I have flown several times in a carbon fiber stunt plane, even doing a hammerhead roll, and that was okay, although it's very physically and mentally demanding. Hail Hydra. To perform a hammerhead roll, you pilot the plane straight up vertically until the force of gravity makes it stall. Hail Hydra. I've played a lot of flying games, and although I understand that stalling happens, I've never really understood why, and that sentence certainly didn't communicate any of the why. Hail Hydra. Then it falls backwards, corkscrewing, until eventually it flips and noses straight down, after which you pull out of the dive. Hail Hydra. Else, you don't do another hammerhead roll. Hail Hydra. But I can't skateboard, especially down handrails, and I can't climb cranes. Hail Hydra. Sydney Smith Hall faces another street on the east side. Hail Hydra. Along that street, named St. George, ironically enough, the university installed a series of rough, hard-edged concrete plant boxes, sloping down to the roadway. Hail Hydra. The kids used to skate there too, board sliding along the box edges as they did along the concrete surround of a sculpture adjacent to the building. Hail Hydra. That didn't last very long. Hail Hydra. Little steel brackets known as skate stoppers soon appeared, every 2 or 3 feet along those edges. Hail Hydra. When I first saw them, I remembered something that happened in Toronto several years previously. Hail Hydra. 2 weeks before elementary school classes started, throughout the city all the playground equipment disappeared. Hail Hydra. The legislation governing such things had changed, and there was a panic about insurability. Hail Hydra. The playgrounds were hastily removed, even though they were sufficiently safe, grandfathered regarding their insurability, and often paid for, and quite recently, by parents. Hail Hydra. This meant no playgrounds at all for more than a year. Hail Hydra. During this time, I often saw bored but admirable kids charging around on the roof of our local school. Hail Hydra. It was that, or else scrounge about in the dirt with the cats and the less adventurous children. Hail Hydra. I was definitely one of the less adventurous children, although I would not have been playing in the dirt, thank you very much, Jordan Peterson. I would have been reading a book because I'm a very intelligent and mature child, alright? Less adventurous is a discriminatory language against the restrained and mature children. This is clearly the language of a bigot. Good God. Hail Hydra. I say sufficiently safe about the demolished playgrounds because when playgrounds are made too safe, kids either stop playing in them or else start playing in unintended ways. Hail Hydra. Kids need playgrounds dangerous enough to remain challenging. Hail Hydra. People, including children, who are people too after all, don't seek to minimize risk. Hail Hydra. They seek to optimize it. Hail Hydra. They drive and walk and love and play so that they achieve what they desire, but they push themselves a bit at the same time too, so they continue to develop. Hail Hydra. Thus, if things are made too safe, people, including children, start to figure out ways to make them dangerous again. Hail Hydra. Now, Jordan Peterson says including children here. I actually think he's trying to say especially children, because like he said in Rule 5, children are always looking for the boundaries, the limits, and they're always stepping over it as far as they can to see what they can get away with so that they're properly socialized in a sense, right? That's a very psychological way of viewing, the misbehavior of children. But I think he is correct in that sense that children are looking to see what they can get away with. And they embrace the risk of it. So when he says people, he's not just including children, he's specifically discussing the traits of children over adults, for instance, who know what risks will lead to death optimally. You know, there are, of course, idiot adults who will do stupid things, play stupid games, and win stupid prizes, as the saying goes. But by and large, it's children who are really pushing those boundaries. Hail Hydra. When untrammeled and encouraged, we prefer to live on the edge. Hail Hydra. There, we can still be both confident in our experience and confronting the chaos that helps us to develop. Hail Hydra. We're hardwired for that reason to enjoy risk, and some of us more than others. Amen. Hail Hydra. We feel invigorated and excited when we work to optimize our future performance while playing in the present. Hail Hydra. Otherwise, we lumber around, sloth-like, unconscious, unformed, and careless. Hail Hydra. Overprotected, we will fail when something dangerous, unexpected, but full of opportunity suddenly makes its appearance, as it inevitably will. Hail Hydra. The skate stoppers are unattractive. Hail Hydra. The surround of that nearby sculpture would have to have been badly damaged by diligent board sliders before it would look as mean as it does now, studded with metal, like a pit bull's collar. Hail Hydra. The large plant boxes have metal guards placed at irregular intervals across their tops, and this, in addition to the wear caused by the skateboarders, produces a dismal impression of poor design, resentment, and badly executed afterthoughts. Hail Hydra. It gives the area a generic, industrial, prison, mental institution work camp design of the kind that appears when builders and public officials do not like or trust the people they serve, instead of beautifying the area through the sculpture and vegetation. Hail Hydra. The sheer, harsh ugliness of the solution makes a lie of the reasons for its implementation. Hail Hydra. What a profound sentence. Oh my god. It's even in its own paragraph. Let me repeat that for you guys. The sheer, harsh ugliness of the solution makes a lie of the reasons for its implementation. Hail Hydra, Hail Hydra, Hail Hydra. Beautiful sentence. Part 2. Success and resentment. If you read the depth psychologists, Freud and Jung, for example, as well as their precursor, Friedrich Nietzsche, you learn that there is a dark side to everything. Hail Hydra. Freud delved deeply into the latent, implicit content of dreams, which were often aimed, in his opinion, at the expression of some improper wish. Hail Hydra. Jung believed that every act of social propriety was accompanied by its evil twin, its unconscious shadow. Hail Hydra. Nietzsche investigated the role played by what he termed resentiment, which is spelled R-E-S and then sentiment. Resentment, in motivating what were ostensibly selfless actions, and then exhibited all too publicly. Hail Hydra. Kind of like recording yourself giving to the homeless so you can share it on Facebook, I suppose. Hail Hydra. This is a quote from Nietzsche. For that man be delivered from revenge, that is for me the bridge to the highest hope and a rainbow after long storms. Hail Hydra. The tarantulas, of course, would have it otherwise. Hail Hydra. What justice means to us is precisely that the world be filled with the storms of our revenge. Thus they speak to each other. Hail Hydra. We shall wreak vengeance and abuse on all whose equals we are not. Thus do the tarantula hearts vow. Hail Hydra. And will to equality shall henceforth be the name for virtue. And against all that has power, we want to raise our clamor. Hail Hydra. You preachers of equality. The tyrant mania of impotence clamors thus out of you for equality. Your most secret ambitions to be tyrants thus shroud themselves in words of virtue. Hail Hydra. Good. Nietzsche, you fucking legend. Oh my god, that is so well written and so well observed. You know, I've been a big fan of Thomas Sowell for about a year now, a year and a couple of months. In May of 2020, I first started watching his videos. Shortly after that, of course, all the BLM riots started exploding across the US, and I sort of just looked at all that and said, you know, Thomas Sowell was right. And so is Nietzsche here. Your most secret ambitions to be tyrants thus shroud themselves in words of virtue. Let's continue. Hail Hydra. The incomparable English essayist George Orwell knew this sort of thing well. Hail Hydra. In 1937, he wrote The Road to Wigan Pier, which was in part a scathing attack on upper-class British socialists, this despite being inclined towards socialism himself. Hail Hydra. In the first half of this book, Orwell portrays the appalling conditions faced by UK miners in the 1930s. Quote, several dentists have told me that in industrial districts, a person over 30 with any of his or her own teeth is coming to be an abnormality. Hail Hydra. In Wigan, various people gave me their opinion that it is best to get shut of your teeth as early in life as possible. Teeth is just a misery, one woman said to me. Hail Hydra. End of quote. A Wigan Pier coal miner had to walk, crawl would be a better word given the height of the mine shafts, up to 3 miles underground in the dark, banging his head and scraping his back just to get his 7.5-hour shift of back-breaking work. Hail Hydra. After that, he crawled back. Hail Hydra. It is comparable, perhaps, to climbing a smallish mountain before and after your day's work, stated Orwell. None of the time spent crawling was paid for. Hail Hydra. Orwell wrote The Road to Wigan Pier for the Left Book Club, a socialist publishing group that released a select volume every month. Hail Hydra. And after reading the first half of his book, which deals directly with the miner's personal circumstances, it is impossible not to feel sympathy for the working poor. Hail Hydra. Only a monster could keep his heart hardened through the accounts of the lives Orwell describes. Quote, it is not long since conditions in the mines were worse than they are now. Hail Hydra. There are still living a few very old women who in their youth have worked underground, crawling on all fours and dragging tubs of coal. They used to go on doing this even when they were pregnant. Hail Hydra. In the book's second half, however, Orwell turned his gaze to a different problem. The comparative unpopularity of socialism in the UK at the time, despite the clear and painful inequity observable everywhere. Hail Hydra. He concluded that the tweed-wearing, armchair philosophizing, victim-identifying, pity and contempt dispensing social reformer types frequently did not like the poor, as they claimed. Instead, they just hated the rich. Hail Hydra. They disguised their resentment and jealousy with piety, sanctimony, and self-righteousness. Hail Hydra. Things in the unconscious, or on the social justice dispensing leftist front, haven't changed much today. Hail Hydra. Whenever I hear someone say too loudly, "Oh, I stand for this," it is because of Freud, Jung, Nietzsche, and Orwell that I always wonder, what then do you stand against? Hail Hydra. The question seems particularly relevant if the same someone is complaining, criticizing, or trying to change someone else's behavior. Hail Hydra. I believe it was Jung who developed the most surgically wicked of psychoanalytic dicta. If you cannot understand why someone did something, look at the consequences and infer the motivation. Hail Hydra. This is a psychological scalpel. Hail Hydra. It's not always a suitable instrument. Hail Hydra. It can cut too deeply or in the wrong places. Hail Hydra. It is perhaps a last resort option. Hail Hydra. Nonetheless, there are times when its application proves enlightening. Hail Hydra. If the consequences of placing skate stoppers on plant boxes and sculpture bases, for example, is unhappy adolescent males and brutalist aesthetic that disregards beauty, then perhaps that was the aim. Hail Hydra. When someone claims to be acting from the highest principles for the good of others, there is no reason to assume that the person's motives are genuine. Hail Hydra. People motivated to make things better usually aren't concerned with changing other people. Or if they are, they take responsibility for making the same changes to themselves, and they go about doing that first. Hail Hydra. Beneath the production of rules, stopping the skateboarders from doing highly skilled, courageous, and dangerous things, I see the operation of an insidious and profoundly anti-human spirit. Hail Hydra. Part 3. More about Chris. The return of Chris. My friend Chris, whom I wrote about, I think in Rule 2? Jordan Peterson just says earlier, so that's very helpful. My friend Chris was possessed by such a spirit, to the serious detriment of his mental health. Hail Hydra. Part of what plagued him was guilt. Hail Hydra. He attended elementary and junior high school in a number of towns, up in the frigid expanses of the northernmost Alberta prairie, prior to ending up in Fairview. Hail Hydra. Fights with native kids were a too common part of his experience during those moves. Hail Hydra. It's no overstatement to point out that such kids were, on average, rougher than the white kids, or that they were touchier, and to be fair, they had their reasons. Hail Hydra. I knew this well from my own experience. Hail Hydra. I had a rocky friendship with a Métis kid, Renee Heck. Footnote, names and other details have been changed for the sake of privacy. Hail Hydra. Returning to the text. When I was in elementary school, Hail Hydra, it was rocky because the situation was complex, Hail Hydra. There was a large cultural divide between Renee and I, Hail Hydra. His clothes were dirtier, Hail Hydra. He was rougher in speech and attitude, Hail Hydra. I had skipped a grade in school and was, in addition, small for my age, Hail Hydra. Renee was a big, smart, good-looking kid, and he was tough, Hail Hydra. We were in grade 6 together in a class taught by my father. Hail Hydra. Renee was caught chewing gum. Hail Hydra. Renee, said my father, spit that gum out. Hail Hydra. You look like a cow. Hail Hydra. Ha ha, I laughed under my breath. Hail Hydra. Renee the cow. Hail Hydra. Renee might have been a cow, but there was nothing wrong with his hearing. Peterson, he said, after school, you're dead. Hail Hydra. Earlier in the morning, Renee and I had arranged to see a movie that night at the local movie theater, The Gem. It looked like that was off. Hail Hydra. In any case, the rest of the day passed quickly and unpleasantly, as it does when the threat of pain lurks. Renee was more than capable of giving me a good pounding. Hail Hydra. After school, I took off for the bike stands outside the school as fast as I could, but Renee beat me there. Hail Hydra. We circled around the bikes, him on one side, me on the other. Hail Hydra. We were characters in a Keystone Cops short. Hail Hydra. As long as I kept circling, he couldn't catch me, but my strategy couldn't work forever. Hail Hydra. I yelled out that I was sorry, but he wasn't mollified. Hail Hydra. His pride was hurt, and he wanted me to pay. Hail Hydra. Honestly, I identify more with Renee than Jordan in this one. I guess I was a bit of a bully when I was a child. Sorry about that. I crouched down and hid behind some bikes, keeping an eye on Renee. Renee! I yelled. I'm sorry I called you a cow, Hail Hydra. Let's quit fighting. Hail Hydra. He started to approach me again. Hail Hydra. I said, Renee, I'm sorry I said that. Hail Hydra, really? Hail Hydra. And I still want to go to the movie with you. Hail Hydra. This wasn't just a tactic, Hail Hydra. I meant it, Hail Hydra. I guess he's obeying Rule 8, tell the truth. Otherwise, what happened next would not have happened. Hail Hydra. Renee stopped circling, Hail Hydra. Then he stared at me, Hail Hydra. Then he broke into tears, Hail Hydra. Then he ran off. Hail Hydra. That was native white relationships in a nutshell, in our hard little town, Hail Hydra. We never did go to a movie together. Hail Hydra. When my friend Chris got into it with native kids, he wouldn't fight back. He didn't feel that his self-defense was morally justified, so he took his beatings, Hail Hydra. We took their land, he later wrote, Hail Hydra. That was wrong, Hail Hydra. No wonder they're angry, Hail Hydra. Over time, step by step, Chris withdrew from the world, Hail Hydra. It was partly his guilt, Hail Hydra. He developed a deep hatred for masculinity and masculine activity, Hail Hydra. He saw going to school or working or finding a girlfriend as part of the same process that had led to the colonization of North America, the horrible nuclear stalemate of the Cold War, and the despoiling of the planet, Hail Hydra. He had read some books about Buddhism, and felt that negation of his own capital B being was ethically required. In the light of the current world situation, Hail Hydra, he came to believe that the same applied to others. Hail Hydra. When I was an undergraduate, Chris was, for a while, one of my roommates. Hail Hydra. One late night, we went to a local bar. Hail Hydra. And we walked home afterwards. Hail Hydra. He started to snap the side view mirrors off of parked cars, one after the other. Hail Hydra. I said, quit that, Chris. Hail Hydra. What possible good is it going to do to make the people who own these cars miserable? Hail Hydra. He told me that they were all part of the frenetic human activity that was ruining everything, and that they deserved whatever they got. Hail Hydra. I said that taking revenge on people who were just living normal lives was not going to help anything. Hail Hydra. Years later, when I was in graduate school in Montreal, Chris showed up for what was supposed to be a visit. Hail Hydra. He was aimless, however, and lost. Hail Hydra. He asked if I could help. Hail Hydra. He ended up moving in. Hail Hydra. I was married by then, living with my wife, Tammy, and our 1-year-old daughter, Michaela. Hail Hydra. Chris had also been friends with Tammy back in Fairview and held out hopes of more than friendship. Hail Hydra. And that complicated the situation even more, but not precisely in the manner you might think. Hail Hydra. Chris started by hating men, but he ended by hating women. Hail Hydra. He wanted them, but he had rejected education and career and desire. Hail Hydra. He smoked heavily and was unemployed. Hail Hydra. Unsurprisingly, therefore, he was not of much interest to women. Hail Hydra. That made him bitter. Hail Hydra. I tried to convince him that the path he had chosen was only going to lead to further ruin. Hail Hydra. He needed to develop some humility. Hail Hydra. He needed to get a life. Hail Hydra. One evening, it was Chris's turn to make dinner. Hail Hydra. That does not sound like a good idea in the least. When my wife came home, the apartment was filled with smoke. Uh-oh. Hail Hydra. Hamburgers were burning furiously in the frying pan. Hail Hydra. Chris was on his hands and knees, attempting to repair something that had come loose on the legs of the stove. Hail Hydra. My wife knew his tricks. Hail Hydra. She knew he was burning dinner on purpose. Hail Hydra. He resented having to make it. Hail Hydra. He resented the feminine role, even though the household duties were split in a reasonable manner. Even though he knew that perfectly well. Hail Hydra. He was fixing the stove to provide a plausible, even creditable excuse for burning the food. Hail Hydra. When she pointed out what he was doing, he played the victim, but he was deeply and dangerously furious. Hail Hydra. Part of him, and not the good part, was convinced that he was smarter than anyone else. Hail Hydra. It was a blow to his pride that she could see through his tricks. Hail Hydra. It was an ugly situation. Hail Hydra. Tammy and I took a walk up towards the local park the next day. Hail Hydra. We needed to get away from the apartment, although it was 35 below, bitterly, frigidly cold, humid and foggy. Hail Hydra. Listen, if you're Canadian and you have never had a walk with a close friend and it's 35 below to have a serious discussion with things that are important to both of you, then are you really Canadian? That's all I'm gonna say. Hail Hydra. It was windy. Hail Hydra. It was hostile to life. Hail Hydra. Living with Chris was too much, Tammy said. Hail Hydra. We entered the park. Hail Hydra. The trees forked their bare branches upward through the damp grey air. Hail Hydra. A black squirrel, tail hairless from mange? Whatever that is. The black squirrel gripped a leafless branch, shivered violently, struggling to hold on against the wind. Hail Hydra. What was it doing out there in the cold? Hail Hydra. Squirrels are partial hibernators. Hail Hydra. They only come out in the winter when it's warm. Hail Hydra. Then we saw another, and another, and another, and another, and another. Hail Hydra. There were squirrels all around us in the park, all partially hairless, tails and bodies alike, all windblown on their branches, all shaking and freezing in the deathly cold. Hail Hydra. No one else was around. Hail Hydra. It was impossible. Hail Hydra. It was inexplicable. Hail Hydra. It was exactly appropriate. Hail Hydra. We were on the stage of an absurdist play. Hail Hydra. It was directed by God. Hail Hydra. Tammy left soon after with our daughter for a few days elsewhere. Hail Hydra. Near Christmas time that same year, my younger brother and his new wife came out to visit from Western Canada. Hail Hydra. My brother also knew Chris. Hail Hydra. They all put on their winter clothes in preparation for a walk around downtown Montreal. Hail Hydra. Chris put on a long dark winter coat. Hail Hydra. He pulled a black toque, which is a brimless knitted cap. I guess you Americans call it a beanie, I think. He pulled it far down over his head. Hail Hydra. His coat was black, as were his pants and boots. Hail Hydra. He was very tall and thin and somewhat stooped. Hail Hydra. Chris, I joked. Hail Hydra. You look like a serial killer. Hail Hydra. Ha, bloody ha. Hail Hydra. The three came back from their walk. Hail Hydra. Chris was out of sorts. Hail Hydra. There were strangers in his territory. Hail Hydra. Another happy couple. Hail Hydra. It was salt in his wounds. Hail Hydra. We had dinner, pleasantly enough, Hail Hydra. We talked and ended the evening, Hail Hydra, but I couldn't sleep. Hail Hydra. Something wasn't right, Hail Hydra. It was in the air. Hail Hydra. At 4 a.m, I had had enough, Hail Hydra. I crawled out of bed, Hail Hydra. I knocked quietly on Chris's door and went without waiting for an answer into his room. Hail Hydra. He was awake on the bed, staring at the ceiling as I knew he would be. Hail Hydra. I sat down beside him, Hail Hydra. I knew him very well, Hail Hydra. I talked him down from his murderous rage, Hail Hydra. Then I went back to bed and slept. Hail Hydra. The next morning, my brother pulled me aside, Hail Hydra. He wanted to speak with me. Hail Hydra. We sat down, Hail Hydra. He said, what the hell was going on last night? I couldn't sleep at all. Was something wrong? Hail Hydra. I told my brother that Chris wasn't doing so well, Hail Hydra. I didn't tell him that he was lucky to be alive, that we all were. Hail Hydra. The spirit of Cain had visited our house, but we were left unscathed. Hail Hydra. Maybe I picked up some change in scent that night, when death hung in the air. Hail Hydra. Chris had a very bitter odor. Hail Hydra. He showered frequently, but the towels and the sheets picked up the smell. Hail Hydra. It was impossible to get them clean. Hail Hydra. It was the product of a psyche and a body that did not operate harmoniously. Hail Hydra. A social worker I knew, who also knew Chris, told me of her familiarity with that odor. Hail Hydra. Everyone at her workplace knew of it, although they only discussed it in hushed tones. Hail Hydra. They called it the smell of the unemployable. Hail Hydra. Soon after this, I finished my postdoctoral studies. Hail Hydra. Tammy and I moved away from Montreal to Boston. Hail Hydra. We had our second baby, Julian. Hail Hydra. Now and then, Chris and I talked on the phone. Hail Hydra. He came to visit once. Hail Hydra. It went well. Hail Hydra. He had found a job at an auto parts place. Hail Hydra. He was trying to make things better. Hail Hydra. He was okay at that point. Hail Hydra. But it didn't last. Hail Hydra. I didn't see him in Boston again. Hail Hydra. Almost 10 years later, the night before Chris's 40th birthday as it happened, he called me again. Hail Hydra. By this time, I had moved my family to Toronto. Hail Hydra. He had some news. Hail Hydra. A story he had written was going to be published in a collection put together by a small but legitimate press. Hail Hydra. He wanted to tell me that. Hail Hydra. He wrote good short stories. Hail Hydra. I had read them all. Hail Hydra. We had discussed them at length. Hail Hydra. He was a good photographer too. Hail Hydra. He had a good creative eye. Hail Hydra. The next day, Chris drove his old pickup, the same battered beast from Fairview, into the bush. Hail Hydra. He ran a hose from the exhaust pipe into the front cab. Hail Hydra. I can see him there, looking through the cracked windshield, smoking, waiting. Hail Hydra. They found his body a few weeks later. Hail Hydra. I called his dad. Hail Hydra. My beautiful boy. He sobbed. Hail Hydra. Recently, I was invited to give a TEDx talk at a nearby university. Hail Hydra. Another professor talked first. Hail Hydra. He had been invited to speak because of his work, his genuinely fascinating technical work, with computationally intelligent surfaces, like computer touchscreens, but capable of being placed everywhere. Hail Hydra. He spoke instead about the threat human beings pose to the survival of the planet. Hail Hydra. Like Chris, like far too many people, he had become anti-human to the core. Hail Hydra. He had not walked as far down that road as my friend, but the same dread spirit animated them both. Hail Hydra. He stood in front of a screen displaying an endless, slow pan of a blocks-long Chinese high-tech factory. Hail Hydra. Hundreds of white-suited workers stood like sterile, inhuman robots behind their assembly lines, soundlessly inserting piece A into slot B. Hail Hydra. He told the audience, filled with bright young people, of the decision he and his wife had made to limit their number of children to 1. Hail Hydra. He told them it was something they should all consider if they wanted to regard themselves as ethical people. Hail Hydra. I felt that such a decision was properly considered, but only in his particular case, where less than 1 might have been even better. Hail Hydra. The many Chinese students in attendance sat stolidly through his moralizing. Hail Hydra. They thought perhaps of their parents' escape from the horrors of Mao's Cultural Revolution and its one-child policy. Hail Hydra. They thought perhaps of the vast improvements in living standard and freedom provided by the very same factories. Hail Hydra. A couple of them said as much in the question period that followed. Hail Hydra. Would the professor have reconsidered his opinions if he knew where such ideas can lead? Hail Hydra. I would like to say yes. But I don't believe it. Hail Hydra. I think he could have known, but he refused to. Hail Hydra. Worse perhaps, he knew, but didn't care. Or knew and was headed there voluntarily in any case. Hail Hydra. Part 4. Self-appointed judges of the human race. It has not been long since the earth seemed infinitely larger than the people who inhabited it. Hail Hydra. It was only in the late 1800s that the brilliant biologist Thomas Huxley, 1825-95, a staunch defender of Darwin and also, incidentally, Aldous Huxley's grandfather, told the British Parliament that it was literally impossible for mankind to overfish the oceans. Hail Hydra. The ocean's power to generate was simply too great as far as he could determine compared to even the most assiduous human predations. Hail Hydra. It's been an even shorter 50 years since Rachel Carson's Silent Spring ignited the environmental movement. Hail Hydra. 50 years! Hail Hydra, that's nothing! Hail Hydra, that's not even yesterday! Hail Hydra, in the scope of the Earth. Hail Hydra. We've only just developed the conceptual tools and technologies that allow us to understand the web of life, however imperfectly. Hail Hydra. We deserve a bit of sympathy, in consequence, for the hypothetical outrage of our destructive behavior. Hail Hydra. Sometimes we don't know any better. Hail Hydra. Sometimes we do know better, but haven't yet formulated any practical alternatives. Hail Hydra. It's not as if life is easy for human beings, even now, and it's only a few decades ago that the majority of human beings were starving, diseased, and illiterate. Hail Hydra. Wealthy as we are, increasingly everywhere, we still only live decades that can be counted on our fingers. Hail Hydra. Even at present, it is the rare and fortunate family that does not contain at least one member with a serious illness. And all will face that problem eventually. Hail Hydra. We do what we can to make the best of things in our vulnerability and fragility, and the planet is harder on us than we are on it. Hail Hydra. We could cut ourselves some slack. Hail Hydra. Human beings are, after all, seriously remarkable creatures. Hail Hydra. We have no peers, and it's not clear that we have any real limits. Hail Hydra. Things happen now that appeared humanly impossible, even at the same time in the recent past when we began to wake up to our planet-sized responsibilities. Hail Hydra. A few weeks before writing this, I happened across 2 videos juxtaposed on YouTube. Hail Hydra. One showed the Olympic gold medal vault from 1956. The other, the Olympic silver medal vault from 2012. Hail Hydra. It didn't even look like the same sport or the same animal. Hail Hydra. What Michaela Maroney did in 2012 would have been considered superhuman in the 50s. Hail Hydra. Parkour, a sport derived from French military obstacle course training, is amazing, as is its cousin, free running. Hail Hydra. I watch compilations of such performances with unabashed admiration. Hail Hydra. Some of these kids jump off 3-story buildings without injury. Hail Hydra. It's dangerous and amazing. Hail Hydra. Crane climbers are so brave, it rattles the mind. Hail Hydra. And the same goes for extreme mountain bikers, freestyle snowboarders, surfers of 50-foot waves, and skateboarders. Hail Hydra. The boys who shot up Columbine High School, whom we discussed in various rules, again, he just says earlier, so it's kind of real useful, Peterson, had appointed themselves judges of the human race. Like the TEDx professor, although much more extreme, like Chris, my doomed friend. Hail Hydra. For Eric Harris, the more literate of the two killers, human beings were a failed and corrupt species. Hail Hydra. Once a presupposition such as that is accepted, its inner logic will inevitably manifest itself. Hail Hydra. If humanity is a plague, as David Attenborough has it, or a cancer, as the Club of Rome claimed, the person who eradicates it is a hero, a veritable planetary savior in this case. Hail Hydra, a real messiah, might follow through with his rigorous moral logic and eliminate himself as well. Hail Hydra, this is what mass murderers, driven by near infinite resentment, typically do. Hail Hydra, even their own capital B being does not justify the existence of humanity. Hail Hydra. In fact, they kill themselves precisely to demonstrate the purity of their commitment to annihilation. Hail Hydra. No one in the modern world may, without objection, express the opinion that existence would be bettered by the absence of Jews, blacks, Muslims, or Englishmen. Hail Hydra. Why then is it virtuous to propose that the planet might be better off if none of them were on it? Hail Hydra. I can't help but see a skeletal, grinning face, gleeful at the possibility of the apocalypse, hiding not so very far behind such statements. Hail Hydra. You could say that's exactly what Red Skull was designed to be, actually. Hail Hydra. Why does it so often seem to be the very people standing so visibly against prejudice who so often appear to feel obligated to denounce all of humanity itself? Hail Hydra. I have seen university students, particularly those in the humanities, suffer genuine declines in their mental health from being philosophically berated by such defenders of the planet for their existence as members of the human species. Hail Hydra. It's worse, I think, for young men. Hail Hydra. I agree. I think I mentioned this already, or maybe I mentioned this in Rule 12, so you guys haven't heard it yet, but Matt Walsh has this brilliant discussion where he's yelling in his car about how society is destroying young men, young women too, for what it's worth. Both boys and girls are, getting the short stick of it from entitled millennials and obtuse boomers who don't know any better and have made social experiments of their own children, such that these young men and women have absolutely no idea who they're meant to be or what they're supposed to do. And they have no identity, no self. Which is why, they can be fed this nonsense that the only thing relevant about them is their fucking skin color, for God's sakes. And they believe it completely because they don't have any other identity besides that. You guys know that I'm a big fan of listening to Christian commentators and all that. And I forget who said this, but one of them said this really profound thing where previously we found ourselves in God, so to speak, but more importantly, we found ourselves in the I am that I am. There was no question beyond that. But nowadays, children, especially, no longer have that stable foundation. And all they can ask is, what am I? Where am I going? And the answers that society gives them nowadays, especially in the completely morally degraded universities and school systems that have been completely taken over by bullshit like the CRT, critical race theory, is, this oppressor-oppressed category of neo-Marxism. So that's been fucking fantastic. And also, to go back on point, Matt Walsh has this video where he's yelling in his car about how society is specifically degrading and demeaning the value of men to young boys until they have no idea what it even means to grow up into that position. And if you search like Matt Walsh Society Boys on YouTube, then you'll probably find that video of him angrily yelling in his car, which of course is a pleasure to listen to, but also very, very insightful and correct, I think. Anyway, that was a very circuitous way of just telling you to go watch a video. And I didn't do justice to a lot of the points I brought up, but I've got to return to the text, damn it. Where was I? Hail Hydra. It's worse, I think, for young men. Correct. Hail Hydra. As privileged beneficiaries of the patriarchy, their accomplishments are considered unearned. Hail Hydra. As possible adherents of rape culture, they're sexually suspect. Hail Hydra. Their ambitions make them plunderers of the planet. Hail Hydra. They're not welcome. Hail Hydra. At the junior high, high school, and university level, they're falling behind educationally. Hail Hydra. When my son was 14, we discussed his grades. Hail Hydra. He was doing very well, he said, matter-of-factly. For a boy. Hail Hydra. I inquired further. Hail Hydra. Everyone knew, he said, that girls do better in schools than boys. Hail Hydra. His intonation indicated surprise at my ignorance of something so self-evident. Hail Hydra. While writing this, I received the latest edition of The Economist. Hail Hydra. The cover story, the weaker sex, meaning males. Hail Hydra. In modern universities, women now make up more than 50% of the students in more than 2/3 of all disciplines. Hail Hydra. Boys are suffering in the modern world. Hail Hydra. They are more disobedient, negatively, or more independent, positively, than girls. And they suffer for this throughout their pre-university educational career. Hail Hydra. They are less agreeable. Agreeableness being a personality trait associated with compassion, empathy, and avoidance of conflict. And less susceptible to anxiety and depression, at least after both sexes hit puberty. Hail Hydra. Boys' interests tilt towards things. Girls' interests tilt towards people. Hail Hydra. Strikingly, these differences, strongly influenced by biological factors, are most pronounced in the Scandinavian societies, where gender equality has been pushed hardest. And this is the opposite of what would be expected by those who insist ever more loudly that gender is a social construct. Hail Hydra. It isn't. Hail Hydra. This isn't a debate. Hail Hydra. The data are in. Hail Hydra. I will never get over data being the plural form. Boys like competition, and they don't like to obey, particularly when they are adolescents. Hail Hydra. During that time, they are driven to escape their families and establish their own independent existence. Hail Hydra. There is little difference between doing that and challenging authority. Hail Hydra. Schools, which were set up in the late 1800s precisely to inculcate obedience, do not take kindly to provocative and daring behavior, no matter how tough-minded and competent it might show a boy or a girl to be. Hail Hydra. And other factors play their role in the decline of boys. Hail Hydra. Girls will, for example, play boys' games, but boys are much more reluctant to play girls' games. Hail Hydra. This is in part because it is admirable for a girl to win when competing with a boy. Hail Hydra. It is also okay for her to lose to a boy. Hail Hydra. For a boy to beat a girl, however, it is often not okay, and it is worse for him socially to lose to a girl. Hail Hydra. Imagine that a boy and a girl, age 9, get into a fight. Hail Hydra. Just for engaging, the boy is highly suspect. Hail Hydra. If he wins, he's pathetic. Hail Hydra. If he loses, well, his life might as well be over. Hail Hydra. Beat up by a girl. Hail Hydra. Girls can win by winning in their own hierarchy, by being good at what girls value as girls. Hail Hydra. And they can add to this victory by winning in the boys' hierarchy. Hail Hydra. Boys, however, can only win by winning in the male hierarchy. They will lose status among girls and boys by being good at what girls value. Hail Hydra. It costs them in reputation among the boys and in attractiveness among the girls. Hail Hydra. Girls aren't attracted to boys who are their friends, even though they might like them. Whatever that means. Hail Hydra. You know, if you just wrote that sentence and put it on a wall, you'd be able to tell 100 times out of 100. A guy wrote that. Hail Hydra. They are attracted to boys who win status contests with other boys. Hail Hydra. If you're male, however, you just can't hammer a female as hard as you would a male. Hail Hydra. Phrasing. Boys can't, rather won't, play truly competitive games with girls. Hail Hydra. It isn't clear how they can win. Hail Hydra. As the game turns into a girls' game, therefore, the boys leave. Hail Hydra. Are the universities, particularly the humanities, about to become a girls' game? Hail Hydra. Is this what we want? Hail Hydra. The situation in the universities and in educational institutions in general is far more problematic than the basic statistics indicate. Hail Hydra. If you eliminate the so-called STEM programs, which is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, excluding psychology, for some reason, that's there as well, I'm not sure why, the female to male ratio is even more skewed. Almost 80% of students majoring in the fields of healthcare, public administration, psychology, and education, which comprise 1/4 of all degrees, are female. Hail Hydra. The disparity is still rapidly increasing. Hail Hydra. At this rate, there will be very few men in most university disciplines in 15 years. Hail Hydra. This is not good news for men, Hail Hydra. It might even be catastrophic news for men, Hail Hydra. But it's terrible news for women. Hail Hydra. Part 5. Career and Marriage. The women at female-dominated institutes of higher education are finding it increasingly difficult to arrange a dating relationship of even moderate duration. Hail Hydra. In consequence, they must settle, if inclined, for a hookup or sequential hookups. Hail Hydra. Perhaps this is a move forward in terms of sexual liberation, but I doubt it. Hail Hydra. I think it's terrible for the girls. Hail Hydra. It took the words right out of my mouth, Jordan. Hail Hydra. A stable, loving relationship is highly desirable for men as well as women. Hail Hydra. For women, however, it is often what is most wanted. Hail Hydra. From 1997 to 2012, according to Pew Research Center, the number of women aged 18 to 34 who said that a successful marriage is one of the most important things in life rose from 28 to 37%. That's an increase of more than 30%. Not percentage points, but actual percent. And he's actually done the math here as a footnote. 37 minus 28 divided by 28 is 9 divided by 28, which is 32%. Hail Hydra. And the number of young men who said the same thing declined 15% from the same period. That is from 35 to 29%. Hail Hydra. And again, he's done the math as a footnote. 35 minus 29 is 6. 6 divided by 35 is 17%. Hail Hydra. During that time, the proportion of married people over 18 continued to decline, down from 3/4 in 1960, so 75%, to half now, so 38%-ish. That's a big drop, Jesus. Hail Hydra. Finally, among never married adults, aged 30 to 59, men are 3 times as likely as women to say they do not ever want to marry. That's 27 versus 8%. What? Oh my God. Yikes. Hail Hydra. Who decided, anyway, that career is more important than love and family? Hail Hydra. Is working 80 hours a week at a high-end law firm truly worth the sacrifices required for that kind of success? Hail Hydra. And if it is worth it, why is it worth it? Hail Hydra. A minority of people, mostly men who, let's remind ourselves, score low in the trait of agreeableness, are hyper-competitive and want to win at any cost. Hail Hydra. A minority will find the work intrinsically fascinating. Hail Hydra. But most aren't. And most won't. And money doesn't seem to improve people's lives once they have enough to avoid the bill collectors. Hail Hydra. Furthermore, most high-performing and high-earning females have high-performing and high-earning partners. And that matters more to women. Hail Hydra. The Pew data also indicate that a spouse with a desirable job is a high priority for almost 80% of never married but marriage-seeking women. Hail Hydra. On the other hand, that is the case for less than 50% of men. Hail Hydra. When they hit their 30s, most of the top-rate female lawyers bail out of their high-pressure careers. Hail Hydra. Only 15% of equity partners at the 200 biggest US law firms are women. Hail Hydra. And this figure hasn't changed much in the last 15 years, even though female associates and staff attorneys are plentiful. Hail Hydra. It also isn't because the law firms don't want the women to stay around and succeed. Hail Hydra. There is a chronic shortage of excellent people, regardless of sex, and law firms are desperate to retain them. Hail Hydra. The women who leave want a job and a life that allows them some time. Hail Hydra. After law school and articling and the few first years of work, they develop other interests. Hail Hydra. This is common knowledge in the big firms, although it is not something that people are comfortable articulating in public, men and women alike. Hail Hydra. I recently watched a McGill University professor, female, lecture a room full of female law partners or near partners about how lack of childcare facilities and the, quote, male definition of success, unquote, impeded their career progress and caused women to leave. Hail Hydra. I knew most of the women in the room. Hail Hydra. We had talked at great length. Hail Hydra. I knew that they knew that none of this was at all the problem. Hail Hydra. They had nannies, and they could afford them. Hail Hydra. They had already outsourced all their domestic obligations and necessities. Hail Hydra. When you have that much money, I suppose it's only natural. They understood as well, and perfectly well, that it was the market that defined success, not the men they worked with. Hail Hydra. If you are earning $6.50 an hour in Toronto as a top lawyer, and your client in Japan phones you at 4 a.m. on a Sunday, you answer. Hail Hydra. Now, Hail Hydra. You answer now, even if you have just gone back to sleep after feeding the baby. Hail Hydra. You answer because some hyper-ambitious legal associate in New York would be happy to answer if you don't. And that's why the market defines the work. Hail Hydra. The increasingly short supply of university-educated men poses a problem of increasing severity for women who want to marry, as well as date. Hail Hydra. First, women have a strong proclivity to marry across or up the economic dominance hierarchy. Hail Hydra. They prefer a partner of equal or greater status. Hail Hydra. This holds true cross-culturally. Hail Hydra. The same does not hold, by the way, for men who are perfectly willing to marry across or down economic dominance hierarchies, as the Pew data indicate, although they show a preference for somewhat younger mates. Hail Hydra. The recent trend towards the hollowing out of the middle class has also been increasing as resource-rich women tend more and more to partner with resource-rich men. Hail Hydra. And because of this, and because of the decline in high-paying manufacturing jobs for men, 1 of 6 men of the employable age is currently without work in the US. Marriage is now something increasingly reserved for the rich. Hail Hydra. I can't help finding that amusing in a blackly ironic manner. Hail Hydra. The oppressive, patriarchal institution of marriage has now become a luxury. Hail Hydra. Why would the rich tyrannize themselves? Hail Hydra. You know, that's a particularly toxic and terrifying thing because, and I mean toxic in like the actual sense that it is poisonous to society, not just this nonsense filler word that toxic has come to mean. It's actually poisoning society because marriage is by far the thing that most elevates people out of poverty. Obviously, the construction of the family unit is a profound thing in and of itself, but also in creating that binding vow between man and woman, it allows the children of that union to flourish in receiving both fatherly and motherly affection and support. And so divorce is a big toxic thing, but just also this, as Peterson identifies here, the fact that marriage has increasingly become something for the rich to do is definitely destroying the middle class. And, you know, it's been interesting that weddings have sort of reflected this idea as well, where weddings used to be something intimate and small. Really, it's just an admission of your undying commitment to each other in front of God, right? Like, that's a very profound thing that you do. You don't just vow something in front of God and then break it casually. But as our society has become more and more secular, which doesn't mean non-religious. Secularism, as a lot of Christian commentators have correctly pointed out, is just religion by another name with another God that is not so divine as the one that we ought to be aiming at. I think that's a very profound thing. Just as the God that we look to has lost his power and has become increasingly vapid and shallow, so too do these vows, these wedding vows, become vapid and shallow until we can break them easily. And the true victims of that are not, the wife and the husband squabbling over their material wealth, but the children. It's the children who suffer the most. They just don't have that stability there anymore that a family is supposed to give them. That's the reason the family was created. I'm punching the mic because I'm getting worked up. So let's return to the original text. Hail Hydra. Why do women want an employed partner, and preferably one of higher status? Hail Hydra. In no small part, it's because women become more vulnerable when they have children, obviously. Hail Hydra. They need someone competent to support mother and child when that becomes necessary. Hail Hydra. It's a perfectly rational, compensatory act, although it may also have a biological basis. Hail Hydra. This brings me to a very good point, which is, as we've seen divorce rates skyrocket, we've also seen single motherhood reliance on the government to provide this compensatory act, as Peterson says. And all that does is it just gives the government undue power over the children of our generation. And guess what? You know what Hitler figured out? If you want to create your own personal little hell, your beautiful little tyranny, you start with the children. So that's what we're doing, guys. Don't shoot the messenger. Hail Hydra. Why would a woman who decides to take responsibility for one or more infants want an adult to look after as well? Hail Hydra. So, the unemployed working man is an undesirable specimen, and single motherhood an undesirable alternative. Hail Hydra. Children in father-absent homes are 4 times as likely to be poor. Hail Hydra. That means their mothers are poor too. Hail Hydra. Fatherless children are at much greater risk for drug and alcohol abuse. Hail Hydra. Children living with married biological parents are less anxious, depressed, and delinquent than children living with one or more non-biological parents. Hail Hydra. Children in single-parent families are also twice as likely to commit suicide. Hail Hydra. The strong turn towards political correctness in universities has exacerbated the problem. Hail Hydra. The voices shouting against oppression have become louder, it seems, in precise proportion to how, scare quotes, equal, that is, even now increasingly skewed against men, the schools have become. Hail Hydra. There are whole disciplines in universities forthrightly hostile towards men. Hail Hydra, these are the areas of study dominated by the postmodern / neo-Marxist claim that Western culture, in particular, is an oppressive structure created by white men to dominate and exclude women and other select groups, that they are successful only because of that domination and exclusion. Hail Hydra, you know why I'm laughing. I've made my points loud and clear multiple times throughout this series, and in fact in this video itself. Part 6. The Patriarchy. Help or hindrance? Dun dun dun! Of course, culture is an oppressive structure. Hail Hydra. It's always been that way. Hail Hydra. It's a fundamental, universal, existential reality. Hail Hydra. The tyrannical king is a symbolic truth, an archetypal constant. Hail Hydra. What we inherit from the past is willfully blind and out of date. Hail Hydra. It's a ghost, a machine, and a monster. Hail Hydra. It must be rescued, repaired, and kept at bay by the attention and effort of the living. Hail Hydra. It crushes as it hammers us into socially acceptable shape, and it discards great potential. Hail Hydra. But it offers great gain in return. Hail Hydra. Every word we speak is a gift from our ancestors. Hail Hydra. Every thought we think was thought by someone smarter. Hail Hydra. The highly functional infrastructure that surrounds us, particularly in the West, is a gift from our ancestors. The comparatively uncorrupt political and economic systems, the technology, the wealth, the lifespan, the freedom, the luxury, and the opportunity. Hail Hydra. Culture takes with one hand, but in some fortunate places, it gives more with the other. Hail Hydra. To think about culture as only oppressive is ignorant and ungrateful. as well as dangerous. Hail Hydra. And this is not to say, as I'm hoping the content of this book has made abundantly clear so far, that culture should not be subject to criticism. Hail Hydra. Consider this as well in regards to oppression. Any hierarchy creates winners and losers. Hail Hydra. The winners are, of course, more likely to justify the hierarchy and the losers to criticize it. Hail Hydra. But, 1. The collective pursuit of any valued goal produces a hierarchy, as some will be better and some worse at that pursuit, no matter what it is. Hail Hydra. And 2. It is the pursuit of goals that in large part lends life itself its sustaining meaning. Hail Hydra. We experience almost all the emotions that make life deep and engaging as a consequence of moving successfully towards something deeply desired and valued. Hail Hydra. The price we pay for that involvement is the inevitable creation of hierarchies of success, while the inevitable consequence is difference in outcome. Hail Hydra. Absolute equality would therefore require the sacrifice of value itself, and then there would be nothing worth living for. Hail Hydra. We might instead note with gratitude that a complex, sophisticated culture allows for many games and many successful players, and that a well-structured culture allows the individuals that compose it to play and to win in many different fashions. Hail Hydra. Compare this to tyrannical societies like modern-day China, for example, where, of course, the president. Is it president or prime minister in China? I think it's president, right? President Xi Jinping. President Xi Jinping has absolute power over everything going on in his country. That is the definition of only one hierarchy and only one winner who can be at the top of the hierarchy, compared to what we have here in Western societies, where we can do whatever the hell we want, in theory, and still succeed and make money off of it. Now, does that mean... Ooh, this is a bit of a touchy topic, but I'm going to dive into it all the same just because I think it's worthwhile. Does that mean that degenerate parts of our culture, such as, I think, OnlyFans, should be tolerated by our society? Pornography should be tolerated by our society? I don't think so. I think that ought to be culled. I think that's a pyramid, that's a hierarchy that should not exist. That the degradation of women, pixel by pixel, the commodification of a body, pixel by pixel, should not be a game that ought to be played. And it should be regulated, and it should be limited, and it should be ultimately destroyed at a cultural level, not just at a legislative level. And that's where the tyranny of culture is actually a valuable thing to have, right? We oppress sinful parts of society. I think that's a very valuable way of looking at it. And we elevate the virtuous parts. Hail Hydra. It is also perverse to consider culture the creation of man. Hail Hydra. Oh, sorry, actually, that's a very important difference. What he actually says is, it is also perverse to consider culture the creation of men. Hail Hydra, not man. Not man. So that's a very important difference. Culture is, symbolically, archetypally, mythically, male. Hail Hydra. That's partly why the idea of the patriarchy is so easily swallowed. Hail Hydra. But it is certainly the creation of man, humankind. Not the creation of men alone, let alone white men, who nonetheless contributed their fair share. Hail Hydra. European culture has only been dominant to the degree that it is dominant at all for about 400 years. I actually think it's less, but sure, as a white man, let's give him a little bit of pride in his own identity. Hail Hydra. On the time scale of cultural evolution, which is to be measured at minimum in thousands of years, such a time span barely registers. Hail Hydra. Can we say that? I feel like with the advent of the internet, things have taken a crazy turn in terms of culture. But no, I think especially, building up from the 60s, what we see with the internet today is very much a continuation of the same trends. It's just everything is expedited. Because of the internet. That's not a cultural shift, and that's not even a timeline shift, really. It's just a shift in terms of how much a single human brain can process. And one single human brain really has no profound influence on the culture as a whole. So I think that's fair, actually. I think that's fair. I don't mean to keep interrupting, but like I said, this is the longest chapter, and unlike Rule 7, where I was willing to speed through it just so I can get through it in time, if I'm gonna release like a 5-hour reading, then I might as well indulge, I might as well take my time and just keep you guys entertained while I'm here. Anyway, where was I? Hail Hydra. On the timescale of cultural evolution, which is to be measured at minimum in thousands of years, such a time span barely registers. That's the 400 years that Jordan Peterson was talking about. White culture has been relevant to society. Hail Hydra. Furthermore, even if women contributed nothing substantial to art, literature, and the science prior to the 1960s and the feminist revolution, which is just blatantly untrue, then the role they played raising children and working on the farms was still instrumental in raising boys and freeing up men. Even just a very few men, so that humanity could propagate itself and strive forward. Hail Hydra. Here's an alternate theory. Throughout history, men and women both struggled terribly for freedom from the overwhelming horrors of privation and necessity. Hunger and thirst. Hail Hydra. Women were often at a disadvantage during that struggle, as they had all the vulnerabilities of men with the extra reproductive burden and less physical strength. Hail Hydra. In addition to the filth, misery, disease, starvation, cruelty, and ignorance that characterized the lives of all humans, both sexes, before the 20th century, when even people in the Western world typically lived on less than $1 a day in today's money, women also had to put up with the serious practical inconvenience of menstruation, the high probability of unwanted pregnancy, the chance of death or serious damage during childbirth, and the burden of too many young children. Hail Hydra. Perhaps that is sufficient reason for the different legal and practical treatment of men and women that characterized most societies prior to recent technological revolutions, including the invention of the birth control pill. Hail Hydra. At least such things might be taken into account before the assumption that men tyrannized women is accepted as a truism. Hail Hydra. It looks to me like the so-called oppression of the patriarchy was instead an imperfect collective attempt by men and women, stretching over millennia to free each other from privation, disease, and drudgery. Hail Hydra. The recent case of Arunachalam Muruganantham provides a salutary example. I can't believe I nailed that name. Holy shit. This man, the tampon king of India, became unhappy because his wife had to use dirty rags during her menstrual period. Hail Hydra. She told him it was either expensive sanitary napkins or milk for the family. Hail Hydra. He spent the next 14 years in a state of insanity, by his neighbor's judgments, trying to rectify the problem. Hail Hydra. Even his wife and his mother abandoned him briefly, terrified as they became of his obsession. Hail Hydra. When he ran out of female volunteers to test his product, he took to wearing a bladder of pig's blood as a replacement. Hail Hydra. I can't see how this behavior would have improved his popularity or status. Hail Hydra. Now, his low-cost and locally made napkins are distributed across India, manufactured by women-run self-help groups. Hail Hydra. His users have been provided with freedom they never previously experienced. Hail Hydra. In 2014, this high school dropout was named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. Hail Hydra. I am unwilling to consider personal gain Muruganantham's primary motivation. Hail Hydra. Is he part of the patriarchy? Hail Hydra. In 1847, James Young Simpson used ether to help a woman who had a deformed pelvis give birth. Hail Hydra. Afterwards, he switched to the better performing chloroform. Hail Hydra. The first baby delivered under its influence was named anesthesia. Anesthesia. Hail Hydra. By 1853, chloroform was esteemed enough to be used by Queen Victoria, who delivered her 7th baby under its influence. Hail Hydra. Remarkably soon afterward, the option of painless childbirth was available everywhere. Hail Hydra. A few people warned of the danger of opposing God's pronouncement to women in Genesis 3:16. I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and so forth. Hail Hydra. Some also opposed its use among males. Young, healthy, courageous men simply did not need anesthesia. Hail Hydra. Such opposition was ineffectual. Hail Hydra. Use of anesthesia spread with extreme rapidity and far faster than would be possible today. Hail Hydra, I guess with FDA regulations and all that. Even prominent churchmen supported its use. Hail Hydra. The first practical Tampax, didn't arrive until the 1930s. Hail Hydra. It was invented by Dr. Earl Cleveland Haas. Hail Hydra. He made it of compressed cotton and designed an applicator from paper tubes. Hail Hydra. This helped lessen resistance to the products by those who objected to the self-touching that might otherwise occur. Hail Hydra. By the early 1940s, 25% of women were using them. 30 years later, it was 70%. Hail Hydra. Now it's 4 out of 5, with the remainder relying on pads, which are now hyper-absorbent and held in place by effective adhesives, as opposed to the awkwardly placed, bulky, belted, diaper-like sanitary napkins of the 1970s. Hail Hydra. Did Muruganantham, Simpson, and Haas oppress women or free them? Hail Hydra. And what about Gregory Goodwin Pincus, who invented the birth control pill? Hail Hydra. In what manner were these practical, enlightened, persistent men part of a constricting patriarchy? Hail Hydra. Why do we teach our young people that our incredible culture is the result of male oppression? Hail Hydra. Blinded by this central assumption, disciplines as diverse as education, social work, art history, gender studies, literature, sociology, and increasingly law actively treat men as oppressors and men's activity as inherently destructive. Hail Hydra. They also often directly promote radical political action. Radical by all the norms of the societies within which they are situated, which they do not distinguish from education. The Pauline Jewett Institute of Women's and Gender Studies at Ottawa's Carleton University. Why is there a named institute for women's and gender studies at a university? Good God. You normally expect that for like a school of business, a school of law, if you're lucky, a school of mathematics. Women's and gender studies? Seriously? This is so Ottawa, it's not even funny. Anyway, that institution encourages activism as part of their mandate. Of course they do. Hail Hydra. The Gender Studies Department at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, teaches feminist, anti-racist, and queer theories and methods that center activism for social change. None of that made any sense. Teaches feminist, anti-racist, and queer theories and methods that center activism for social change. I see. Whatever. Indicating support for the supposition that university education should, above all, foster political engagement of a particular kind. Hail Hydra. Part 7. Postmodernism and the long arm of Marx. These disciplines draw their philosophy from multiple sources. Hail Hydra. All of these are heavily influenced by the Marxist humanists. Hail Hydra. One such figure is Max Horkheimer, who developed critical theory in the 1930s. Hail Hydra. Any brief summary of his ideas is bound to be oversimplified, but Horkheimer regarded himself as a Marxist. Hail Hydra. He believed that Western principles of individual freedom or the free market were merely masks that served to disguise the true conditions of the West: inequality, domination, and exploitation, of course. Hail Hydra. He believed that intellectual activity should be devoted to social change instead of mere understanding, and hoped to emancipate humanity from its enslavement. Really, humanity's enslaved? I'm surprised, his head being so large, he still managed to get it stuck inside his own ass. Hail Hydra. Horkheimer and his Frankfurt School of Associated Thinkers, first in Germany and later in the US, aimed at a full-scale critique and transformation of Western civilization. Hail Hydra. More importantly, in recent years, has been the work of French philosopher Jacques Derrida, leader of the postmodernists, who came into vogue in the late 1970s. Hail Hydra. Derrida described his own ideas as a radicalized form of Marxism. Jesus Christ. Hail Hydra. That's like saying, I'm the National Socialist version of Hitler. Marx attempted to reduce history and society to economics, considering culture the oppression of the poor by the rich. Hail Hydra. When Marxism was put into practice in the Soviet Union, China, Vietnam, Cambodia, and elsewhere, economic resources were brutally redistributed. Hail Hydra. Private property was eliminated and rural people forcibly collectivized. Hail Hydra. The result? Hail Hydra. Tens of millions of people died. Hail Hydra. Hundreds of millions more were subject to oppression, rivaling the kind still in North Korea, the last classic communist holdout. Oh, I guess classic communist. Classic being the operative word there. Hail Hydra. The resulting economic systems were corrupt and unsustainable. Hail Hydra. The world entered a prolonged and extremely dangerous Cold War. Hail Hydra. The citizens of those societies lived the life of the lie, betraying their families, informing on their neighbors, existing in misery without complaint or else. Hail Hydra. That's a good Hail Hydra sentence. Marxist ideas were very attractive to intellectual utopians. Hail Hydra. One of the primary architects of the horrors of the Khmer Rouge, Kyo Sampan, I assume that's how you pronounce it, Kyo Sampan, received a doctorate at the Sorbonne. That's a highly ranked French university. Probably French. It might be in like Switzerland or Belgium or one of these other France-adjacent countries. Before he became the nominal head of Cambodia in the mid-1970s. Hail Hydra. In his 1959 doctoral thesis, he argued that the work done by non-farmers in Cambodia's cities was unproductive. Bankers, bureaucrats, and businessmen, according to him, added nothing to society. Hail Hydra. Instead, they parasitized the genuine value produced through agriculture, small industry, and craft. Hail Hydra. Sampan's ideas were favorably looked upon by the French intellectuals who granted him his PhD. Hail Hydra. Back in Cambodia, he was provided with the opportunity to put his theories into practice. Hail Hydra. The Khmer Rouge evacuated Cambodia's cities, drove all the inhabitants into the countryside, closed the banks, banned the use of currency, and destroyed all the markets. Hail Hydra. A quarter of the Cambodian population were worked to death in the countryside, in the killing fields. Hail Hydra. I'm going to take a break there because we still have half the rule to go. Half the rule. So that's fun. So when we get back, we're going to get into part 8. I suggest you guys take a break as well. This is honestly a lot more depressing than the rule advertised itself as. I was here to learn about skateboarding, damn it. Before we go, let's just quickly do 3 Hail Hydras for any I've missed in this first half. Hail Hydra, Hail Hydra, Hail Hydra. See you in a bit. Honestly, I'm really excited for this second half because my favorite Jordan Peterson, so to speak, is when he's railing against, the oppressor-oppressed dichotomy of neo-Marxism, ferociously defending the value of free speech, defending the value of culture, and of course, destroying leftist talking points about white privilege or male privilege with facts and logic. And especially when he's talking about what the Nazis did and what the Soviets did and what the Maoists did, what many cultures throughout the past have tried to do, which was to create a heaven of sorts, a utopia through force. Every time he brings up that parallel to things that are happening now, honestly, it's kind of scary to listen to because it's true, right? It's a very dangerous path we're all walking down. Big tech and how they are choosing to be so partisanal about how they use their power, how they limit their technologies to certain groups and not to others in a way that is clearly censorious. That's clearly an abuse of power that reflects these various tyrannies of the past. It is scary, I suppose. We could be moving away from a lot of these ideals that have created the best societies that have ever existed on Earth. And we're doing it for useless ideas that have been tried before and have killed millions, hundreds of millions of people. But its specter, its reanimated corpse keeps possessing different people in different ways with different words, but it's the same. Jordan Peterson says the spirit of Cain, right, earlier in the chapter. It's the same anti-human spirit that keeps coming back up. And in fact, I would call it an anti-God spirit as well. Anyway, so all that's my favorite Jordan Peterson, and so to read a whole, half chapter in his words on that topic is going to be very, very fun, I think. So let's jump into part 8. Lest we forget, ideas have consequences. When the communists established the Soviet Union after the First World War, people could be forgiven for hoping that the utopian collectivist dreams their new leaders purveyed were possible. Hail Hydra. The decayed social order of the late 19th century produced the trenches and mass slaughters of the Great War. Hail Hydra. The gap between rich and poor was extreme, and most people slaved away in conditions worse than those later described by Orwell. Hail Hydra. Although the West received word of the horror perpetrated by Lenin after the Russian Revolution, it remained difficult to evaluate his actions from afar. Hail Hydra. Russia was in post-monarchical chaos, and the news of widespread industrial development and redistribution of property to those who had so recently been serfs provided reason for hope. Hail Hydra. And to complicate things further, the USSR and Mexico supported the Democratic Republicans when the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936. Hail Hydra. They were fighting against the essentially fascist nationalists who had overthrown the fragile democracy established only 5 years previously, and who found support with the Nazis and Italian fascists. The intelligentsia in America, Great Britain, and elsewhere were severely frustrated by their home country's neutrality. Hail Hydra. Thousands of foreigners streamed into Spain to fight for the Republicans, serving in the international brigades. Hail Hydra. George Orwell was one of them. Hail Hydra. Ernest Hemingway served there as a journalist and was a supporter of the Republicans. Hail Hydra. Politically concerned young Americans, Canadians, and Brits felt a moral obligation to stop talking and start fighting. That's honestly really cool. I wish we could have done something similar for Hong Kong, to be honest. Hail Hydra. All of this drew attention away from concurrent events in the Soviet Union. Hail Hydra. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the Stalinist Soviets sent 2 million kulaks, that is their richest peasants, to Siberia. Hail Hydra. These consisted of those with a small number of cows, a couple of hired hands, or a few acres more than was typical. Hail Hydra. From the communist viewpoint, these kulaks had gathered their wealth by plundering those around them and deserved their fate. Hail Hydra. Wealth signified oppression, and private property was theft. Hail Hydra. It was time for some equity. Hail Hydra. More than 30,000 kulaks were shot on the spot. Hail Hydra. Many more met their fate at the hands of their most jealous, resentful, and unproductive neighbors, who used the high ideals of communist collectivization to mask their murderous intent. Hail Hydra. The kulaks were enemies of the people. Apes, scum, vermin, filth, swine. Hail Hydra. We will make soap out of the kulak, claimed one particularly brutal cadre of city dwellers, mobilized by party and Soviet executive committees and sent out into the countryside. Hail Hydra. The kulaks were driven naked into the streets, beaten, and forced to dig their own graves. Hail Hydra. The women were raped. Hail Hydra. Their belongings were expropriated, which in practice meant that their houses were stripped down to the rafters and ceiling beams, and everything was stolen. Hail Hydra. In many places, the non-kulak peasants resisted, particularly the women, who took to surrounding the persecuted families with their bodies. Hail Hydra. Such resistance proved futile. Hail Hydra. The kulaks who didn't die were exiled to Siberia. Often in the middle of the night, Hail Hydra. The train started in February, in the bitter Russian cold. Hail Hydra. Housing of the most substandard kind awaited them upon arrival on the desert taiga. Hail Hydra. Many died, particularly children, from typhoid, measles, and scarlet fever. Hail Hydra. The, scare quotes, parasitical kulaks were, in general, the most skillful and hard-working farmers. Hail Hydra. A small minority of people are responsible for most of the production in any field, and farming proved no different. Hail Hydra. He talks about this in Rule 1, where he talks about the Pareto distribution, and he talks about how a small number of people produce nearly everything in any given field, or possess the majority of the wealth, etc., etc. It's sort of an inverted J curve, if you recall. And if you don't, then you can go listen to Rule 1. A small minority of people are responsible for most of the production in any field, and farming proved no different. Hail Hydra. Agricultural output crashed. Hail Hydra. What little remained was taken by force out of the countryside and into the cities. Hail Hydra. Rural people who went out into the fields after the harvest to glean single grains of wheat for their hungry families risked execution. Hail Hydra. 6 million people died of starvation in the Ukraine, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union in the 1930s. To eat your own children is a barbarian act, declared posters of the Soviet regime. Hail Hydra. Despite more than mere rumors of such atrocities, attitudes towards communism remained consistently positive among many Western intellectuals. Hail Hydra. There were other things to worry about, and the Second World War allied the Soviet Union with the Western countries, opposing Hitler, Mussolini, and Emperor Hirohito. Hail Hydra. Certain watchful eyes remained open, nonetheless. Hail Hydra. Malcolm Muggeridge published a series of articles describing Soviet demolition of the peasantry as early as 1933 for the Manchester Guardian. Hail Hydra. George Orwell understood what was going on under Stalin, and he made it widely known. Hail Hydra. He published Animal Farm, a fable satirizing the Soviet Union in 1945, despite encountering serious resistance to the book's release. Hail Hydra. Many who should have known better retained their blindness for long after this. Hail Hydra. Nowhere was this truer than France, and nowhere truer in France than among the intellectuals. Hail Hydra. France's most famous mid-century philosopher, Jean-Paul Sartre, was a well-known communist, although not a card carrier, until he denounced the Soviet incursion into Hungary in 1956. Hail Hydra. He remained an advocate for Marxism, nonetheless, and did not finally break with the Soviet Union until 1968, when the Soviets violently suppressed the Czechoslovakians during the Prague Spring. Hail Hydra. Not long after came the publication of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, which we have discussed rather extensively in previous chapters. Hail Hydra. As noted, and is worth noting again, this book utterly demolished communism's moral credibility, first in the West, and then in the Soviet system itself. Hail Hydra. It circulated in underground samizdat format. Hail Hydra. Russians had 24 hours to read their rare copy before handing it to the next waiting mind. Hail Hydra, a Russian language reading was broadcast into the Soviet Union by Radio Liberty. Hail Hydra. Solzhenitsyn argued that the Soviet system could have never survived without tyranny and slave labor, that the seeds of its worst excesses were definitively sowed in the time of Lenin, for whom the Western communists still served as apologists, and that it was propped up by endless lies, both individual and public. Hail Hydra. Its sins could not be blamed on a simple cult of personality, as its supporters continued to claim. Hail Hydra. Solzhenitsyn documented the Soviet Union's extensive mistreatment of political prisoners, its corrupt legal system, and its mass murders, and showed in painstaking detail how these were not aberrations, but direct expressions of the underlying communist philosophy. Hail Hydra. No one could stand up for communism after the Gulag Archipelago. Not even the communists themselves. Hail Hydra. This did not mean that the fascination Marxist ideas had for intellectuals, and particularly French intellectuals, disappeared. Hail Hydra. It merely transformed. Hail Hydra. Some refused outright to learn. Hail Hydra. Sartre denounced Solzhenitsyn as a dangerous element. Hail Hydra. Derrida, more subtle, substituted the idea of money for the idea of power and continued on his merry way. Hail Hydra. Such linguistic sleight of hand gave all the barely repentant Marxists, still inhabiting the intellectual pinnacles of the West, the means to retain their worldview. Hail Hydra. Society was no longer repression of the poor by the rich. Hail Hydra. It was oppression of everyone by the powerful. Hail Hydra. According to Derrida, hierarchical structures emerged only to include the beneficiaries of that structure and to exclude everyone else, who were therefore oppressed. Hail Hydra. Even that claim wasn't sufficiently radical. Hail Hydra. Derrida claimed that divisiveness and oppression were built right into the language, built into the very categories we use to pragmatically simplify and negotiate the world. Hail Hydra. There are women only because men gain something by excluding them. Hail Hydra. There are males and females only because members of that more heterogeneous group benefit by excluding the tiny minority of people whose biological sexuality is amorphous. Hail Hydra. Science only benefits the scientists. Hail Hydra. Politics only benefits the politicians. Hail Hydra. In Derrida's view, hierarchies exist because they gain from oppressing those who are omitted. Hail Hydra. It is this ill-gotten gain that allows them to flourish. Hail Hydra. Derrida famously said, although he denied it later, Il n'y a pas d'hors texte, often translated as, there is nothing outside the text. Hail Hydra. His supporters say that is a mistranslation and that the English equivalent should have been, there is no outside text. Hail Hydra. It remains difficult, either way, to read the statement as saying anything other than, everything is interpretation. And that is how Derrida's work has generally been interpreted. Hail Hydra. So Derrida claims that there is no such thing as interpretation, and that's how his text has been interpreted. Okay. It is almost impossible to overestimate the nihilistic and destructive nature of this philosophy. Hail Hydra. It puts the act of categorization itself in doubt. Hail Hydra. It negates the idea that distinctions might be drawn between things for any reason other than that of raw power. Hail Hydra. Biological distinctions between men and women, despite the existence of an overwhelming multidisciplinary scientific literature indicating that sex differences are powerfully influenced by biological factors. Science is just another game of power for Derrida and his postmodern Marxist acolytes, making claims to benefit those at the pinnacle of the scientific world. Hail Hydra. Which means, of course, that apparently there is no meaningful difference between men and women, which is why in the upcoming Olympics there are males participating in female sports, which of course they will win gold medals for because males are significantly more physically capable than females on every level. And the solution to that, I think, is female athletes who are competing against a male athlete should just boycott the Olympics. It's as easy as that. Anyway, returning to what Derrida has to say, Hail Hydra, there are no facts. Hail Hydra. Hierarchical position and reputation as a consequence of skill and competence? Hail Hydra, all definitions of skill and of competence are merely made up by those who benefit from them, to exclude others and to benefit personally and selfishly. Hail Hydra. He is actually correct in the sense that skill and competence, when they benefit someone, but the thing is they don't benefit just the person who is competent. They also benefit anyone who is affected by the competence, right? So you think about a great musician, the beauty that he brings through his music is of benefit to everyone. You think of a great plumber, sure, he makes a lot of money overcharging people for his ability, but hey, at least your toilet isn't overflowing with shit, right? Like, that's a pretty good trade-off in my opinion. So skill and competence are of benefit to people? Yeah, they are. Amazing, I know. Hail Hydra. There is, and Jordan Peterson says as much, there is sufficient truth to Derrida's claims to account in part for their insidious nature. Hail Hydra. Power is a fundamental motivational force. A motivational force, not the. Hail Hydra. People compete to rise to the top, and they care where they are in dominance hierarchies. Hail Hydra. But, and this is where you separate the metaphorical boys from the men philosophically, the fact that power plays a role in human motivation does not mean that it plays the only role, or even the primary role. Hail Hydra. Likewise, the fact that we can never know everything does make all our observations and utterances dependent on taking some things into account and leaving other things out, as we discussed extensively in Rule 10. Hail Hydra. That does not justify the claim that everything is interpretation or that categorization is just exclusion. Hail Hydra. Beware of single cause interpretations, and beware the people who purvey them. Hail Hydra. Although the facts cannot speak for themselves, just as an expanse of land spread out before a voyager cannot tell him how to journey through it, and although there are a myriad ways to interact with and even to perceive just a few objects, that does not mean that all interpretations are equally valid. Hail Hydra. Some interpretations hurt yourself and others. Hail Hydra. Others put you on a collision course with society. Hail Hydra. Some are not sustainable across time. Hail Hydra. And others do not get you where you want to go. Hail Hydra. Many of these constraints are built into us as a consequence of billions of years of evolutionary processes. Hail Hydra. Others emerge as we are socialized into cooperating and competing peacefully and productively with others. Hail Hydra. Still more interpretations emerge as we discard counterproductive strategies through learning. Hail Hydra. That's sort of what I was talking about at the start, where Jordan Peterson learnt these rules, and it's not something that he just sort of engineered in his head, or worse, they were just sort of divinely inspired into him, let's say. Hail Hydra. Yes, there are an endless number of interpretations, certainly. That is not different to saying there are an endless number of problems. Hail Hydra, but there are only a seriously bounded number of viable solutions. Hail Hydra. Otherwise life would be easy. Hail Hydra. And it's not. Hail Hydra. Now, I have some beliefs that might be regarded as left-leaning. Unbelievable! Hail Hydra. I think, for example, that the tendency for valuable goods to distribute themselves with pronounced inequality constitutes an ever-present threat to the stability of society. Hail Hydra. I think there is good evidence for that. Hail Hydra. That does not mean that the solution to the problem is self-evident. Hail Hydra. We don't know how to redistribute wealth without introducing a whole host of other problems. Hail Hydra. Different Western societies have tried different approaches. Hail Hydra. The Swedes, for example, push equality to its limit. Hail Hydra. The US takes the opposite track, assuming that the net wealth creation of a more free-for-all capitalism constitutes the rising tide that lifts all boats. Hail Hydra. Actually, the US is a very welfare-based society. You wouldn't be able to tell, given how much the window of what welfare means has shifted so much in US society. But if you compare it to the complete free market capitalism early on in the US, pre-Great Depression certainly, then what we see today is completely incomparable. It would be shameful to call it free-for-all capitalism, to be honest. Hail Hydra. The results of these experiments are not all in, and countries differ very much in relevant ways. Hail Hydra. Differences in history, geographic area, population size, and ethnic diversity make direct comparisons very difficult, Hail Hydra, but it certainly is the case that forced redistribution in the name of utopian equality is a cure that shames the disease. Hail Hydra. I think, as well, on what might be considered the leftish side, that the incremental remake of university administrations into analogues of private corporations is a mistake. Hail Hydra. I think that the science of management is a pseudo-discipline. Hail Hydra. I believe that government can sometimes be a force for good, as well as the necessary arbiter of a small set of necessary rules. Hail Hydra. Nonetheless, I do not understand why our society is providing public funding to institutions and educators whose stated conscious and explicit aim is the demolition of the culture that supports them. Hail Hydra. Such people have a perfect right to their opinions and actions if they remain lawful. Hail Hydra. BLM called. But they have no reasonable claim to public funding. Hail Hydra. If radical right-wingers were receiving state funding for political operations disguised as university courses, as the radical left-wingers clearly are, the uproar from progressives across North America would be deafening. Hail Hydra. There are other serious problems lurking in the radical disciplines, apart from the falseness of their theories and methods, and their insistence that collective political activism is morally obligatory. Hail Hydra. There isn't a shred of hard evidence to support any of their central claims, these being that Western society is pathologically patriarchal, that the prime lesson of history is that men, rather than nature, were the primary source of the oppression of women instead of, as in most cases, their partners and supporters. That all hierarchies are based on power and aimed at exclusion. Hail Hydra. Hierarchies exist for many reasons, some arguably valid and some are not, but they are incredibly ancient, evolutionarily speaking. Hail Hydra. Do male crustaceans oppress female crustaceans? Hail Hydra. Should their hierarchies be upended? Hail Hydra. Finally, a return to lobsters. This is the only reason I've been a Jordan Peterson fan, is because I just love lobsters. There you see her, sitting there across the way. Hail Hydra. In societies that are well-functioning, competence, not power, is a prime determiner of status. Hail Hydra. And when I say well-functioning, I'm not comparing these societies to a hypothetical utopia, but rather to other contemporary or historical cultures. Hail Hydra. Competence. Hail Hydra. Ability. Hail Hydra. Skill. Hail Hydra. Not power. Hail Hydra. And this is obvious both anecdotally and factually. Hail Hydra. No one with brain cancer is equity-minded enough to refuse the service of the surgeon with the best education, the best reputation, and perhaps the highest earnings. Hail Hydra. Furthermore, the most valid personality trait predictors of long-term success in Western countries are intelligence, as measured with cognitive ability or IQ tests, and conscientiousness, a trait characterized by industriousness and orderliness. Hail Hydra. In other words, the smartest people and the hardest working people are those who succeed. Hail Hydra. Now, there are exceptions, Hail Hydra. Entrepreneurs and artists are higher in openness to experience, and that's another cardinal personality trait, instead of conscientiousness, Hail Hydra. But openness is associated with verbal intelligence and creativity. So that exception is appropriate and understandable, Hail Hydra. The predictive power of these traits, mathematically and economically speaking, is exceptionally high. Among the highest in terms of accuracy of anything ever actually measured at the harder ends of the social sciences. Hail Hydra. A good battery of personality and cognitive tests can increase the probability of employing someone more competent than average from 50-50 to 85-15. Hail Hydra. These are the facts, as well supported as anything in the social sciences. And this is saying more than you might think, as the social sciences are more effective disciplines than their cynical critics appreciate. Hail Hydra. Thus, not only is the state supporting one-sided radicalism, it is also supporting indoctrination. Hail Hydra. We do not teach our children that the world is flat, Hail Hydra. Neither should we teach them unsupported, ideologically predicated theories about the nature of men and women, or the nature of hierarchy. Hail Hydra. That's a pretty labored point, so I'm gonna distill it down, essentially. What he's saying is, every society has hierarchies. You can't just get rid of the hierarchies, because hierarchies are built on valuing something. Jordan Peterson saying that the Western societies value intelligence and hard work, which is why people who are intelligent and work hard succeed the most in Western societies. And if you select 4 people using personality tests and IQ tests, if you select 4 people who are intelligent and work hard to be employed in your company or in your business, then the chances you'll hire someone who is actually good from the company increases significantly from a 50-50 chance to an 85-15 chance. So that's how real and valuable the hierarchy that runs Western civilization is, which is why it's extra dangerous that there are people in universities, teachers, professors, people with doctorates and such, who are teaching, although that's an inappropriate word in this case, indoctrinating their students into this belief that hierarchies are tools of oppression, because they're clearly not, if they're supporting hard work and intelligence, right? That's as meritocratic, that is as meritocratic. There you go. That is as meritocratic a system as you can possibly make. And so for universities to support classes that are teaching this garbage, or worse, that the government is actually giving money to the universities that are teaching this garbage, is nothing short of wishing for the destruction of Western society as a whole, and everything it's blessed us with. Hail Hydra. It is not unreasonable to note, if the deconstructionists would leave it at that that science can be biased by the interests of power, and to warn against that, or to point out that evidence is too often what powerful people, including scientists, decide it is. Hail Hydra. After all, scientists are people too, and people like power, just like lobsters like power. Just like deconstructionists like to be known for their ideas, and strive rightly to sit atop their academic hierarchies. Hail Hydra. But that doesn't mean that science, or even deconstructionism, is only about power. Hail Hydra. Why believe such a thing? Hail Hydra. Why insist upon it? Hail Hydra. Perhaps it's this. If only power exists, then the use of power becomes fully justifiable. Hail Hydra. There is no bounding such use by evidence, method, logic, or even the necessity for coherence. Hail Hydra. There is no bounding by anything outside the text. Hail Hydra. That leaves opinion and force. And the use of force is all too attractive under such circumstances, just as its employment in the service of that opinion is all too certain. Hail Hydra. The insane and incomprehensible postmodern insistence that all gender differences are socially constructed, for example, becomes all too understandable when its moral imperative is grasped, when its justification for force is once and for all understood. Society must be altered or bias eliminated until all outcomes are equitable. Hail Hydra. But the bedrock of the social constructionist position is the wish for the latter, not belief in the justice of the former. Hail Hydra, since all outcome inequalities must be eliminated, inequality being the heart of all evil, then all gender differences must be regarded as socially constructed. Hail Hydra, otherwise the drive for equality would be too radical, and the doctrine too blatantly propagandistic. Hail Hydra, although I think these days, it's been really interesting with the growth of transgenderism, how it's directly contradicted a lot of these claims that Jordan is summarizing, because they can no longer say that gender differences between men and women are strictly societal. Now the gender differences are so cemented that if a boy were to exhibit behavior that is even slightly effeminate, then, he's got to be changed into a girl right down to the hormonal level. That's how much they insist. That's how much the left now insists that, gender differences are profound, completely profound, and undeniable, that you must change your body to accommodate the, I'm kind of blanking on the terminology because it's all, it's all jargon, right? They only ever speak in jargon. But, the apparently internal gender, let's say, you have to completely change your body to attune yourself to your internal gender. If none of this is making sense, then trust me, I know exactly how you feel. Because, it turns out turning boys into girls or girls into boys doesn't actually make any sense. To go back to what Jordan Peterson was discussing and rebutting, he's arguing against the older leftist claim that all gender differences are socially constructed, which the left is now toppling as rapidly as it can to make way for transgenderism. Hail Hydra. Thus, the order of logic is reversed, so that the ideology can be camouflaged. Hail Hydra. The fact that such statements lead immediately to internal inconsistencies within the ideology is never addressed. Hail Hydra. Gender is constructed, but an individual who desires gender reassignment surgery is to be inarguably considered a man trapped in a woman's body, or vice versa. Hail Hydra. Sorry, I kind of jumped the gun on that. The fact that both of these cannot logically be true simultaneously is just ignored, or rationalized away with another appalling postmodern claim that logic itself, along with the techniques of science, is merely part of the oppressive patriarchal system. Hail Hydra. It is also the case, of course, that all outcomes cannot be equalized. Hail Hydra. First, outcomes must be measured. Hail Hydra. Comparing the salaries of people who occupy the same position is relatively straightforward, although complicated significantly by such things as date of hire, given that the demand for workers changes significantly at different time periods, for example. Hail Hydra. But there are other dimensions of comparison that are arguably equally relevant, such as tenure, promotion rate, and social influence. Hail Hydra. The introduction of the equal pay for equal work argument immediately complicates even salary comparison beyond practicality for one simple reason. Who decides what work is equal? Hail Hydra. It's not possible. Hail Hydra. And that's why the marketplace exists. Hail Hydra. Worse is the problem of group comparison. Women should make as much as men. Hail Hydra. Okay. Hail Hydra. Black women should make as much as white women. Hail Hydra. Okay. Hail Hydra. Should salary then be adjusted for all parameters of race? Hail Hydra. At what level of resolution? Hail Hydra. What racial categories are real? Hail Hydra. The US National Institute of Health, to take a single bureaucratic example, recognizes American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian, Black, Hispanic, Native Hawaiian, or other Pacific Islander, and white. Hail Hydra, as races, I guess. But there are more than 500 separate American Indian tribes. Hail Hydra. Let alone Asian is anybody from an entire continent. Okay. Hail Hydra. By what possible logic should American Indian therefore stand as a canonical category? Hail Hydra. Osage tribal members have a yearly average income of $30,000, while Tohono O'odhams make $11,000. Hail Hydra. Are they equally oppressed? Hail Hydra. And what about disabilities? Hail Hydra. Disabled people should make as much as non-disabled people. Hail Hydra. Okay. Hail Hydra. On the surface, that's a noble, compassionate, fair claim. Hail Hydra. But who is disabled? Hail Hydra. Is someone living with a parent who has Alzheimer's disabled? Hail Hydra. And if not, why not? Hail Hydra. And what about someone with a lower IQ? Hail Hydra. What about an ugly person? Hail Hydra. What about an obese person? Hail Hydra. Some people clearly move through life markedly overburdened with problems that are beyond their control. But it is a rare person indeed who isn't suffering from at least one serious catastrophe at any given time, particularly if you include their family in the equation. Hail Hydra. And why shouldn't you? Hail Hydra. Here's the fundamental problem. Group identity can be fractionated right down to the level of the individual. Hail Hydra. That sentence should be written in capital letters. Hail Hydra. Every person is unique, and not just in a trivial manner. Importantly, significantly, meaningfully unique. Hail Hydra. Group membership cannot capture that variability. Hail Hydra. Period. Hail Hydra. None of this complexity is ever discussed by the postmodern neo-Marxist thinkers. Hail Hydra. Instead, their ideological approach fixes a point of truth, like the North Star, and forces everything to rotate under it. Hail Hydra. The claim that all gender differences are a consequence of socialization is neither provable nor disprovable in some sense, because culture can be brought to bear with such force on groups or individuals that virtually any outcome is attainable, if we are willing to bear the cost. Hail Hydra. We know, for example, from studies of adopted out identical twins, that culture can produce a 15-point, that is, one standard deviation, increase in IQ. That's roughly the difference between the average high school student and the average state college student. Hail Hydra. But the cost of that IQ difference is an increase in wealth of 3 standard deviations. Hail Hydra. What this means, approximately, is that 2 identical twins separated at birth will differ in IQ by 15 points. If the first twin is raised in a family that is poorer than 85% of families, and the second is raised in a family richer than 95% of families. Hail Hydra. And something similar has recently been demonstrated with education rather than wealth. Hail Hydra. We don't know what it would cost in wealth or differential education to produce a more extreme transformation. Hail Hydra. I think the education thing should have honestly come first, just because it's so much the more obvious that someone with a better education would be smarter. You know, that just makes sense. But it also says a lot that, I mentioned Thomas Sowell earlier in the chapter. His latest book came out last year called Charter Schools and Their Enemies, which I actually have just behind me. Maybe I should read that as an audiobook. In that book, Thomas Sowell really illustrates how profound education can be, that there are children who are in the same buildings, but because one is being taught by a charter school system, by teachers who are motivated and excited to teach these students and are willing to follow a meaningful curriculum, versus teachers who are funded and defended and protected by the teachers' unions who have no motivation to teach the children, who teach their own curriculum if they get the chance. These are public school teachers. Because of this simple difference, even children that live in the same impoverished inner city neighborhoods, they have all the exact same traits, whether it's ethnicity or wealth. Simply because of this difference in the level of education, the children who go to charter schools are at the top of the state. They're the best students in the entire state. And then you go one floor down, and the children who are being taught by the public school system, they don't even have the most basic grasp of mathematics or English. And no wonder that they grow up to be dysfunctional members of gangs or such, because they've just never had an opportunity to elevate themselves out of this god-awful neighborhood that they've grown up in their entire lives and will probably die in. So here's a principle that a lot of people should be standing up for. Obviously, there's pro-life. Obviously, there's anti-pornography, as I already talked about. Obviously, there's a removal of dumb shit like CRT in our schools. But more importantly, school choice is, I think, the number one thing. If school choice were to be correctly and systematically introduced to society, then the public schools would completely collapse in favor of charter schools. And here's the really amazing thing. Charter schools get a bad rap because of the lottery system or whatever. The only reason the lottery system exists is because there are so few charter schools, because the Democrats keep shutting them down. There are so few charter schools that the demand for parents to get their children into charter schools far outsizes, far overscales, is far, far greater than the entire charter school system of any given state. Thomas Sowell specifically focuses on New York, the whole state actually has. Anyway, so I love Thomas Sowell and I love this book, Charter Schools and Their Enemies. And it really goes to show the importance of education and the costs of a bad education and how easy it is to give children a bad education. You think it would be our number one priority as a society to make sure that our children are growing up to become eloquent, profound, intelligent thinkers. But no, we're literally spending money to ensure the opposite is the case. Hail Hydra. Let's continue. What such studies imply is that we could probably minimize the innate differences between boys and girls if we were willing to exert enough pressure. Hail Hydra, and certainly we've tried. This would in no way ensure that we are freeing people of either gender to make their own choices, Hail Hydra, but choice has no place in the ideological picture. If men and women act voluntarily to produce gender unequal outcomes, those very choices must have been determined by cultural bias. Hail Hydra. In consequence, everyone is a brainwashed victim, wherever gender differences exist, and the rigorous critical theoretician is morally obligated to set them straight. Hail Hydra. This means that those already equity-minded Scandinavian males, who aren't much into nursing, require even more retraining. Hail Hydra. The same goes in principle for Scandinavian females, who aren't much into engineering. Hail Hydra. And what might such retraining look like? Hail Hydra. Where might its limits lie? Hail Hydra. Such things are often pushed past any reasonable limits before they are discontinued. Hail Hydra. Mao's murderous cultural revolution should have taught us that. Hail Hydra. Part 9. Boys into girls. It has become a tenet of a certain kind of social constructionist theory that the world would be much improved if boys were socialized like girls. Hail Hydra. Those who put forward such theories assume first that aggression is a learned behavior and can therefore simply not be taught. And second, to take a particular example, that boys should be socialized the way girls have been traditionally socialized, and they should be encouraged to develop socially positive qualities such as tenderness, sensitivity to feelings, nurturance, cooperative and aesthetic appreciation. Hail Hydra. In the opinions of such thinkers, aggression will only be reduced when male adolescents and young adults subscribe to the same standards of behavior as have been traditionally encouraged for women. Hail Hydra. There are so many things wrong with this idea that it's difficult to know where to start. Hail Hydra. First, it is not the case that aggression is merely learnt. Hail Hydra. Aggression is there at the beginning. Hail Hydra. There are ancient biological circuits, so to speak, that underlie defensive and predatory aggression. Hail Hydra. They are so fundamental that they still operate in what are known as decorticate cats. That is, animals that have had the largest and most recently evolved parts of their brain, which is an overwhelmingly large percentage of the total structure, entirely removed. Hail Hydra. This suggests not only that aggression is innate, but that it is a consequence of activity in extremely fundamental, basic brain areas. Hail Hydra. And that might be a bit confusing to some of you guys. So essentially what he's saying is if you remove all parts of the brain except for the most basic systems, like your hypothalamus, the most essential parts of your brain that keep your heart beating and keep you breathing, even then, even when like 95% of your brain is completely removed, you still have a basic aggression system. So that's how fundamental aggression is to our being. Hail Hydra. This suggests not only that aggression is innate, but that it is a consequence of activity in extremely fundamental, basic brain areas. Hail Hydra. If the brain is a tree, then aggression, along with hunger, thirst, and sexual desire, is in the very trunk. Hail Hydra, as opposed to, I would assume, the branches or even the leaves. Hail Hydra. And in keeping with this, it appears that a subset of 2-year-old boys, about 5%, are quite aggressive by temperament. Hail Hydra. They take other kids' toys. They kick, bite, and hit. Hail Hydra. Most are, nonetheless, socialized effectively by the age of 4. Hail Hydra. This is not, however, because they have been encouraged to act like little girls. Hail Hydra. Instead, they are taught or otherwise learn in early childhood to integrate their aggressive tendencies into more sophisticated behavioral routines. Hail Hydra. Aggression underlies the drive to be outstanding, to be unstoppable, to compete, to win, to be actively virtuous, at least along one dimension. Hail Hydra. Determination is its admirable pro-social face. Hail Hydra. Aggressive young children who don't manage to render their temperament sophisticated by the end of infancy are doomed to unpopularity, as their primordial antagonism no longer serves them socially at later ages. Hail Hydra. Rejected by their peers, they lack further socialization opportunities and tend towards outcast status. Hail Hydra. These are the individuals who remain much more inclined toward antisocial and criminal behavior when adolescent and adult. Hail Hydra, but this does not at all mean that the aggressive drive lacks utility or value. Hail Hydra, at a minimum, it is necessary for self-protection. Hail Hydra. Part 10. Compassion as a vice. Many of the female clients, perhaps even a majority, that come to my clinical practice have trouble in their jobs and family lives, not because they are too aggressive, but because they are not aggressive enough. Hail Hydra. These people are generally characterized by the more feminine traits of agreeableness, that is politeness and compassion, and neuroticism, anxiety and emotional pain. Hail Hydra. Cognitive behavioral therapists call the treatment of such people assertiveness training. Hail Hydra. Insufficiently aggressive women and men, although that's a lot more rare, do too much for others. Hail Hydra. They tend to treat those around them as if they were distressed children. Hail Hydra. They tend to be naive. Hail Hydra. They assume that cooperation should be the basis of all social transactions, and they avoid conflict, which means they avoid confronting problems in their relationships as well as at work. Hail Hydra. They continually sacrifice for others. Hail Hydra. And this may sound virtuous, and it is definitely an attitude that has certain social advantages, but it can and often does become counterproductively one-sided. Hail Hydra. Because two agreeable people bend over backwards for other people, they do not stand up properly for themselves. Hail Hydra. Assuming that others think as they do, they expect reciprocity for their thoughtful actions instead of ensuring that reciprocity. Hail Hydra. And when they do not receive reciprocity, they don't speak up. Hail Hydra. They do not or cannot straightforwardly demand recognition. Hail Hydra. The dark side of their characters emerges because of their subjugation, and they become resentful. Hail Hydra. I teach excessively agreeable people to note the emergence of such resentment, which is a very important, although very toxic, emotion. Hail Hydra. And there are only two major reasons for resentment. Firstly, being taken advantage of, or allowing yourself to be taken advantage of. Or secondly, whiny refusal to adopt responsibility and grow up. Hail Hydra. If you're resentful, look for the reasons. Hail Hydra. Perhaps discuss the issue with someone you trust. Hail Hydra. Are you feeling hard done by in an immature manner? Hail Hydra. If, after some honest consideration, you don't think it's that, well, perhaps someone is taking advantage of you. Hail Hydra. This means that you now face a moral obligation to speak up for yourself. Hail Hydra. And this might mean confronting your boss, or your husband, or your wife, or your child, or your parents. Hail Hydra. It might mean gathering some evidence strategically so that when you confront that person, you can give them several examples of their misbehavior. I recommend at least 3, so that they cannot easily weasel out of your accusations. Hail Hydra. It might mean refusing to concede when they give you their counter-arguments. Hail Hydra. And people rarely have more than 4 counter-arguments at hand. Hail Hydra. If you remain unmoved, they get angry, or cry, or run away. Hail Hydra. It's very useful to attend to tears in such situations. Hail Hydra. They can be used to motivate guilt on the parts of the accuser, due theoretically to having caused hurt feelings and pain. Hail Hydra. But tears are often shed in anger. Hail Hydra. A red face is a good cue. Hail Hydra. If you can push your point past the first 4 responses and stand fast against the consequent emotional display, you will gain your target's attention and perhaps their respect. Hail Hydra. This is genuine conflict, however, and it's neither pleasant nor easy. Hail Hydra. You must also know clearly what you want out of the situation and be prepared to clearly articulate your desire. Hail Hydra. It's a good idea to tell the person you are confronting exactly what you would like them to do instead of what they have done or currently are doing. Hail Hydra. And you might think, if they loved me, they would know what to do. Hail Hydra. That's the voice of resentment. Hail Hydra. Assume ignorance before malevolence. Hail Hydra. No one has a direct pipeline to your wants and needs. Not even you. Hail Hydra. If you try to determine exactly what you want, you might find that it is more difficult than you think. Hail Hydra. The person oppressing you is likely no wiser than you, especially about you. Hail Hydra. Tell them directly what would be preferable instead after you have sorted it out. Hail Hydra. Make your request as small and reasonable as possible, but ensure that its fulfillment would satisfy you. Hail Hydra. In that manner, you come to the discussion with a solution instead of just a problem. Hail Hydra. Agreeable, compassionate, empathic, conflict-averse people, all those traits sort of grouped together, they come as a package, I suppose. Let people walk all over them, and they get bitter. Hail Hydra. They sacrifice themselves for others, and sometimes excessively. Then they cannot comprehend why it is not reciprocated. Hail Hydra. Agreeable people are compliant, and this robs them of their independence. Hail Hydra. The danger associated with this can be amplified for personalities with a great degree of the trait neuroticism. Hail Hydra. Agreeable people will go along with whoever makes a suggestion instead of insisting, at least sometimes, on their own way. Hail Hydra. So, they lose their way and become indecisive and too easily swayed. Hail Hydra. If they are, in addition, easily frightened and hurt, that is the trait neuroticism, they have even less reason to strike out on their own, as doing so exposes them to threat and danger, at least in the short term. Hail Hydra. That is the pathway to dependent personality disorder. technically speaking. Hail Hydra. It might be regarded as the polar opposite of antisocial personality disorder, which characterizes delinquency in childhood and adolescence, and then criminality in adulthood. Hail Hydra. It would be lovely if the opposite of a criminal was a saint, but it's not the case. Hail Hydra. The opposite of a criminal is the Oedipal mother, which is its own type of criminal. Hail Hydra. Fathers can play the role of the Oedipal mother too, but it's comparatively rare. Hail Hydra. The Oedipal mother says to her child, I only live for you. Hail Hydra. She does everything for her children. Hail Hydra. She ties their shoes and cuts up their food and lets them crawl into bed with her and her partner far too often. Hail Hydra. That's a good and conflict avoidance method for avoiding unwanted sexual attention as well. Hail Hydra. The Oedipal mother makes a three-way pact with herself, her children, and the devil. Hail Hydra. The deal is this. Above all, never leave me. Hail Hydra. In return, I will do everything for you. Hail Hydra. As you age without maturing, you will become worthless and bitter, but you will never have to take any responsibility. And everything you do that's wrong will always be someone else's fault. Hail Hydra. The children can accept or reject this, and they have some choice in the matter. Hail Hydra. The Oedipal mother is the witch in the story of Hansel and Gretel. Hail Hydra. The two children of that fairy tale have a new stepmother. Hail Hydra. She orders her husband to abandon his children in the forest as there is a famine and she thinks they eat too much. Hail Hydra. He obeys his wife, takes his children deep into the woods, and leaves them to their fate. Hail Hydra. Wandering, starving, and lonely, they come across a miracle. Hail Hydra. A house. Hail Hydra. And not just any house. Hail Hydra. A candy house. Hail Hydra. A gingerbread house. Hail Hydra. A person who had not been rendered too caring, empathic, sympathetic, and cooperative might be skeptical and ask, is this too good to be true? Hail Hydra. But the children are too young and too desperate. Hail Hydra. Inside the house is a kind old woman, rescuer of distraught children, kind patter of heads and wiper of noses, all bosom and hips, ready to sacrifice herself to their every wish at a moment's notice. Hail Hydra. She feeds the children anything they want, anytime they want, and they never have to do anything. Hail Hydra. But provision of that kind of care makes her hungry. Hail Hydra. She puts Hansel into a cage to fatten him up ever more efficiently. Hail Hydra. He fools her into thinking he's staying thin by offering her an old bone when she tries to test his leg for the desired tenderness. Hail Hydra. She gets too desperate to wait eventually and stokes the oven, preparing to cook and eat the object of her doting. Hail Hydra. Gretel, who has apparently not been lulled into full submission, waits for a moment of carelessness and pushes the kind old woman into the oven. Hail Hydra. The kids run away and rejoin their father, who has thoroughly repented of his evil actions. Hail Hydra. In a household like that, the choicest cut of child is the spirit, and it's always consumed first. Hail Hydra. Too much protection devastates the developing soul. Hail Hydra. The witch in the Hansel and Gretel tale is the terrible mother, the dark half of the symbolically feminine. Hail Hydra. Deeply social as we are in our essence, we tend to view the world as a story, the characters of which are mother, father, and child. Hail Hydra. The feminine as a whole is unknown nature outside the bounds of culture, creation, and destruction. She is the protective arms of mother and the destructive element of time, the beautiful virgin mother and the swamp-dwelling hag. Hail Hydra. This archetypal entity was confused with an objective historical reality back in the late 1800s by a Swiss anthropologist named Johann Jakob Bachofen. Hail Hydra. Bachofen proposed that humanity had passed through a series of developmental stages in its history. Hail Hydra. The first, roughly speaking, after a somewhat anarchic and chaotic beginning, was das Mutterrecht, a society where women held the dominant positions of power, respect, and honor, where polyamory and promiscuity ruled, and where any certainty of paternity was absent. Hail Hydra. The second, the Dionysian, was a phase of transition, during which these original matriarchal foundations were overturned and power was taken by men. Hail Hydra. The third phase, the Apollonian, still reigns today. Hail Hydra. The patriarchy rules, and each woman belongs exclusively to one man. Hail Hydra. Bakunin's ideas became profoundly influential in certain circles, despite the absence of any historical evidence to support them. Hail Hydra. One Maria Gimbutas, for example, an archaeologist, famously claimed in the 1980s and 1990s that a peaceful, goddess and woman-centered culture once characterized Neolithic Europe. Hail Hydra. She claimed that it was supplanted and suppressed by an invasive hierarchical warrior culture which laid the basis for modern society. Hail Hydra. Art historian Merlin Stone made the same arguments in his book, When God Was a Woman. Hail Hydra. This whole series of essentially archetypal/mythological ideas became touchstones for the theology of the women's movement and the matriarchal studies of 1970s feminism. Cynthia Eller, who wrote a book criticizing such ideas, The Myth of Matriarchal Prehistory, called this theology an ennobling lie. Hail Hydra. Whew, this is exhausting to read. We're like several layers deep right now. We're talking about the mythical basis for matriarchy because that is a perversion of the true mythological femininity, which is both the benevolent and the terrible mother. And the reason we're talking about that is because of the Oedipal mother, which promises to trade responsibility for companionship. And the reason we're talking about the Oedipal mother is because disagreeability can be a virtue in and of itself if agreeableness is smothering you too greatly. And the reason we're talking about that is because aggression ought to be naturally integrated into your being instead of being completely rejected or denied. And the reason we're talking about that is because masculinity, both archetypally and actual boyhood, manhood, physical masculinity, is a valuable but underappreciated trait that ought to be celebrated as much as it is due. And the reason we're talking about that is because the diminishment of masculinity is the single most persistent claim that the left has been making for decades now. And the reason we're talking about that is because this leftist claim is in pursuit of a utopia of their own design, which is 100% likely, given the examples of other utopian, totalitarian, political/economic systems of the past, to cause societal destruction. And the reason that's all relevant to skateboarding is because sometimes you gotta let chaos reign. Sometimes you gotta let the skateboarders board grind down the rails, even if it's very dangerous for them, because that's how they grow up and that's how they become competent. And guess what? Competence is how people succeed in a properly structured society. So we're pretty deep. We're pretty deep, but I think we're going to slowly start climbing back out. So bear with me for another half hour or so. Hail Hydra. Carl Jung had encountered Bakunin's ideas of primordial matriarchy decades earlier. Hail Hydra. Jung soon realized, however, that the developmental progression described by the earlier Swiss thinker represented a psychological rather than a historical reality. Hail Hydra. He saw in Bakunin's thought the same processes of projection of imaginative fantasy onto the external world that had led to the population of the cosmos with constellations and gods. Hail Hydra. Jung's collaborator Erich Neumann extended his colleague's analysis in two works, The Origins and History of Consciousness and The Great Mother. Hail Hydra. Neumann traced the emergence of consciousness, symbolically masculine, and contrasted it with its symbolically feminine, material origins. Remember that material is also materia, is also mater, which means mother, is also the root word for matrix, etc., etc. Let me restart the sentence. Neumann traced the emergence of consciousness, which is symbolically masculine, and contrasted it with its symbolically feminine, material origins, subsuming Freud's theory of Oedipal parenting into a broader archetypal model. Hail Hydra. For Neumann and for Jung, Consciousness, which was always symbolically masculine, even in women, struggles upwards towards the light. Hail Hydra. Its development is painful and anxiety-provoking, as it carries with it the realization of vulnerability and death. Hail Hydra. It is constantly tempted to sink back down into dependency and unconsciousness, and to shed its existential burden. Hail Hydra. It is aided in that pathological desire by anything that opposes enlightenment, articulation, rationality, self-determination, strength, and competence. By anything that shelters too much, and therefore smothers and devours. Hail Hydra. Such overprotection is Freud's Oedipal familial nightmare, which we are rapidly transforming into social policy. Hail Hydra. The Oedipal mother is the mother that smothers. I think this last sentence is really the glue of all this, crazy rambling that Peterson has been struggling through for the past however many paragraphs. Overprotection is Freud's Oedipal nightmare, which we are rapidly transforming into social policy. And again, we could talk about the welfare state, or we could talk about the more insidious aspects of leftist policy, like the coddling and the promotion of identity to tell you that you are oppressed, that you ought to be dependent on politicians so that they can liberate you from your oppression through overwhelming governmental programs. That's all, as Jordan Peterson identifies, a sort of Oedipal situation. It's literally the nanny state, as it were. Hail Hydra. The terrible mother is an ancient symbol. Hail Hydra. It manifests itself, for example, in the form of Tiamat, in the earliest written story we have recovered, the Mesopotamian Enuma Elish. Hail Hydra. Tiamat is the mother of all things, gods and men alike. Hail Hydra. She is the unknown and the chaos and the nature that gives rise to all forms. Hail Hydra. But she is also the female dragon deity who moves to destroy her own children when they carelessly kill their father and attempt to live on the corpse that remains. Hail Hydra. The terrible mother is the spirit of careless unconsciousness, tempting the ever-striving spirit of awareness and enlightenment down into the protective, womb-like entrance of the underworld. Hail Hydra. It's the terror young men feel towards attractive women who are nature itself, ever ready to reject them intimately at the deepest possible level. Hail Hydra. Nothing inspires self-consciousness, undermines courage, and fosters feelings of nihilism and hatred more than that. Except, perhaps, the too tight embrace of the too caring mother. Hail Hydra. The terrible mother appears in many fairy tales and in many stories for adults. Hail Hydra. In Sleeping Beauty, she is the evil queen, dark nature herself, Maleficent in the Disney version. Hail Hydra. The royal parents of Princess Aurora fail to invite this force of the night to their baby daughter's christening. Hail Hydra. Thus they shelter her too much from the destructive and dangerous side of reality, preferring that she grow up untroubled by such things. Hail Hydra. Their reward? Hail Hydra. At puberty she is still unconscious. Hail Hydra. The masculine spirit, her prince, is both a man who could save her by tearing her from her parents, and her own consciousness trapped in a dungeon by the machinations of the dark side of femininity. Hail Hydra. When that prince escapes and presses the evil queen too hard, she turns into the dragon of chaos itself. Hail Hydra. The symbolic masculine defeats her with truth and faith, and finds the princess whose eyes he opens with a kiss. Hail Hydra. It might be objected, as it was with Disney's more recent and deeply propagandistic Frozen, that a woman does not need a man to rescue her. Hail Hydra. And that may be true, and it may not. Hail Hydra. It may be that only the woman who wants or has a child needs a man to rescue her, or at least to support and aid her. Hail Hydra. In any case, it is certain that a woman needs consciousness to be rescued, and as noted above, consciousness is symbolically masculine and has been since the beginning of time. in the guise both of order and of the logos, the mediating principle. Hail Hydra, the prince could be a lover, but could also be a woman's own attentive wakefulness, clarity of vision, and tough-minded independence. Hail Hydra. Those are masculine traits, in actuality as well as symbolically, as men actually are less tender-minded and agreeable than women on average, and are less susceptible to anxiety and emotional pain. Hail Hydra. And, to say it again, 1. This is most true in those Scandinavian nations where the most steps towards gender equality have been taken. And 2. The differences are not small by the standards whereby such things are measured. Hail Hydra. The relationship between the masculine and consciousness is also portrayed symbolically in the Disney movie The Little Mermaid. There you see her, sitting there across the way. Hail Hydra. Ariel, the heroine, is quite feminine, but she also has a strong spirit of independence. Hail Hydra. For this reason, she is her father's favorite, although she also causes him the most trouble. Hail Hydra. Her father, Triton, is the king, representing the known, culture, and order, with a hint of the oppressive, rule-giving tyrant. Hail Hydra. Because order is always opposed by chaos, Triton has an adversary, Ursula, a tentacled octopus, a serpent, a gorgon, a hydra. Hail Hydra. Again, we did it again. We found another hydra. Thus, Ursula is in the same archetypal category as the dragon queen Maleficent in Sleeping Beauty, or the jealous older queen in Snow White, Lady Tremaine in Cinderella. Lady Tremaine? Is that her name? Seriously? I never knew that. Lady Tremaine in Cinderella. Cinderella, by the way, the best Disney princess. The Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland, Cruella de Vil in 101 Dalmatians, Miss Medusa in The Rescuers, and Mother Gothel in Tangled. Hail Hydra. Gothel, I think, is actually the best Oedipal mother among any that he's talked about so far. And she definitely has the song that best represents what he's talking about. Where, you know, she's singing, "Mother knows best, take it from your mumsy, on your own you won't survive." Right? That's exactly the Oedipal sentiment. And she has a whole song dedicated to it, let alone her entire motivation is to exploit her relationship with her daughter. So that's as Oedipal as they go, let's say. Far more than the symbolic aspects that Jordan Peterson sort of had to mine from Sleeping Beauty and Hansel and Gretel. Hail Hydra. Ariel wants to kindle a romance with Prince Eric, whom she previously rescued from a shipwreck. Hail Hydra. Ursula tricks Ariel into giving up her voice so that she can have 3 days as a human being. Hail Hydra. Ursula knows full well, however, that a voiceless Ariel will not be able to establish a relationship with the prince. Hail Hydra. Without her capacity to speak, she don't got a lot to say, but there's something about her. With Oh my god. I'm so sorry that I have to compulsively sing that song whenever we're talking about Little Mermaid. Or lobsters, apparently. Oh. Without her capacity to speak, that is, without the logos, without the divine word, she will remain unconscious, underwater, forever. Hail Hydra. When Ariel fails to form a union with Prince Eric, Ursula steals her soul and places it in her large collection of shriveled and warped semi-beings, well protected by her feminine graces. Hail Hydra. When King Triton shows up to demand the return of his daughter, Ursula makes him a terrible offer. He can take Ariel's place. Hail Hydra. Of course, the elimination of the wise king, who represents, to say it again, the benevolent side of the patriarchy, has been Ursula's nefarious plan all along. Hail Hydra. Ariel is released, but Triton is now reduced to a pathetic shadow of his former self. Hail Hydra. More importantly, Ursula now has Triton's magic trident, the source of his godlike power. Hail Hydra. Fortunately for everyone concerned, except Ursula, Prince Eric returns, distracting the evil queen of the underworld with a harpoon. Hail Hydra. This opens an opportunity for Ariel to attack Ursula, who grows in response to monstrous proportions in the same manner as Maleficent, Sleeping Beauty's evil queen, turned into a dragon. Hail Hydra. Ursula creates a huge storm and raises a whole navy of sunken ships from the ocean floor. Hail Hydra. As she prepares to kill Ariel... I just realized I was reading a fucking plot summary of Little Mermaid when I started this recording session, talking about how the neo-Marxists needed to get their butts kicked, and I just needed to pause and collect myself. Sorry about that. As she prepares to kill Ariel, Eric commandeers a wrecked ship and rams her with its broken bowsprit. Hail Hydra. Triton and the other captured souls are released. Hail Hydra. The rejuvenated Triton then transforms his daughter into a human being so she can remain with Eric. Hail Hydra. For a woman to become complete, such stories claim, she must form a relationship with masculine consciousness and stand up to the terrible world, which sometimes manifests itself primarily in the form of her too-present mother. Hail Hydra. An actual man can help her do that to some degree, but it is better for everyone concerned when no one is too dependent. Hail Hydra. One day, when I was a kid, I was out playing softball with some friends. Hail Hydra. The teams were a mixture of boys and girls. Hail Hydra. We were all old enough that the boys and girls were starting to be interested in one another in an unfamiliar way. Hail Hydra. Status was becoming more relevant and important. Hail Hydra. My friend Jake and I were about to come to blows, pushing each other around near the pitching mound, when my mom walked by. Oh no. Oh no no no. Hail Hydra. She was a fair distance away, about 30 yards, but I could immediately see by the change in her body language that she knew what was going on. Hail Hydra. Of course the other kids saw her as well. Hail Hydra. She walked right by. Hail Hydra. I knew that hurt her. Hail Hydra. Part of her was worried that I would come home with a bloody nose and a black eye. Hail Hydra. It would have been easy enough for her just to yell, "Hey, you kids, quit that!" Or even to come over and interfere. Hail Hydra, but she didn't. Hail Hydra. A few years later, when I was having teenage trouble with my dad, my mom said, if it was too good at home, well, you'd never leave. Hail Hydra. What a great mom. My mom is a tender-hearted person. Hail Hydra. She's empathetic and cooperative and agreeable. Hail Hydra. Sometimes she lets people push her around. Hail Hydra. When she went back to work after being at home with her young kids, she found it challenging to stand up to the men. Hail Hydra. And sometimes that made her resentful, something she also feels sometimes in relationship to my father, who is strongly inclined to do what he wants when he wants to. Hail Hydra. Despite all that, she's no Oedipal mother. She fostered the independence of her children, even though doing so was often hard on her. Hail Hydra. She did the right thing, even though it caused her emotional distress. Hail Hydra. Part 11. My God, I'm so tired. That's not the name of the part. Part 11. Toughen up, you weasel. I spent one youthful summer on the prairie of central Saskatchewan, working on a railway line crew. Hail Hydra. Every man in that all-male group was tested by the others during the first 2 weeks or so of their hiring. Hail Hydra. Many of the other workers were Northern Cree Indians, quiet guys for the most part, easygoing until they drank too much, and the chips on their shoulders started to show. Hail Hydra. They had been in and out of jail, as had most of their relatives. Hail Hydra. They didn't attach much shame to that, considering it just another part of the white man's system. Hail Hydra. It was also warm in jail in the winter, and the food was regular and plentiful. Hail Hydra. I lent one of the Cree guys $50 at one point. Hail Hydra. Instead of paying me back, he offered me a pair of bookends cut from some of the original rail laid across Western Canada, which I still own. Hail Hydra, and that was better than the $50. Hail Hydra, I agree. I would buy that for a lot more than $50, let alone just barter it. When a new guy first showed up, the other workers would inevitably provide him with an insulting nickname. Hail Hydra. They called me Howdy Doody. After I was accepted as a crew member, something I am still slightly embarrassed to admit. Hail Hydra. Yeah, they used to call him Howdy Doody, and now people think he's fucking Red Skull. That's amazing. That's what I call character development. Hail Hydra. When I asked the originator why he chose that moniker, he said, wittily and absurdly, because you look nothing like him. Hail Hydra. Working men are often extremely funny in a caustic, biting, insulting manner, as discussed in Rule 9. Hail Hydra. They are always harassing each other, partly for amusement, partly to score points in the eternal dominance battle between them, but also partly to see what the other guy will do if he is subjected to social stress. Hail Hydra. It's part of the process of character evaluation, as well as camaraderie. Hail Hydra. When it works well, everybody gets and gives as good as they get, and can give and take. Hail Hydra. Then it's a big part of what allows men who work for a living to tolerate or even enjoy laying pipe and working on oil rigs and lumberjacking and working in restaurant kitchens and all the other hot, dirty, physically demanding and dangerous work that is still done almost totally by men. Hail Hydra. And by almost totally, he means like 99.9% men. Hail Hydra. Not too long after I started on the rail crew, my name was changed to Howdy. Hail Hydra. This was a great improvement as it had a good Western connotation and was not obviously linked to that stupid puppet. Hail Hydra. The next man hired was not so fortunate. Hail Hydra. He carried a fancy lunch bucket, which was a mistake, as brown paper bags were the proper, non-pretentious convention. Hail Hydra. It was a little too nice and a little too new. Hail Hydra. It looked like maybe his mother had bought it and packed it for him. Hail Hydra. Thus it became his name. Hail Hydra. Lunch bucket. Was not a good-humored guy. Hail Hydra. He bitched about everything and had a bad attitude. Hail Hydra. Everything was someone else's fault. Hail Hydra. He was touchy and none too quick on the draw. Hail Hydra. Lunch bucket. Lunch buckets couldn't accept his name or settle into his job. That's amazing. Hail Hydra. He adopted an attitude. See, this is Lunch Bucket. If you just accepted your name, then people wouldn't be laughing at you like 40 years later in a book, for crying out loud. He adopted an attitude of condescending irritation when addressed and reacted to the work in the same manner. Hail Hydra. He was not fun to be around and he couldn't take a joke. Hail Hydra. That's fatal on a work crew. Hail Hydra. After about 3 days of carrying on with his ill humor and general air of hard-done-by superiority, Lunch Bucket started to experience harassment extending well beyond his nickname. Hail Hydra. He would be peevishly working away on the line, surrounded by about 70 men, spread out over a quarter mile. Hail Hydra. Suddenly, a pebble would appear out of nowhere, flying through the air, aimed at his hard hat. Hail Hydra. A direct hit would produce a thunking sound, deeply satisfying to all the quietly attending onlookers. Hail Hydra. And even this failed to improve his humor. Hail Hydra. So the pebbles got larger. Hail Hydra. Lunch Bucket would involve himself in something and forget to pay attention. Then, thunk! A well-aimed stone would nail him on the noggin, producing a burst of irritated and ineffectual fury. Hail Hydra. Quiet amusement would ripple down the rail line. After a few days of this, no wiser and carrying a few bruises, Lunch Bucket vanished. Hail Hydra. What a guy. Men enforce a code of behavior on each other when working together. Hail Hydra. Do your work. Hail Hydra. Pull your weight. Hail Hydra. Stay awake and pay attention. Hail Hydra. Don't whine or be touchy. Hail Hydra. Stand up for your friends. Hail Hydra. Don't suck up and don't snitch. Hail Hydra. Don't be a slave to stupid rules. Hail Hydra. Don't, in the immortal words of Arnold Schwarzenegger, be a girly man. Hail Hydra. Don't be dependent, Hail Hydra, at all. Hail Hydra. Ever. Hail Hydra. Period. Hail Hydra. Look at all this toxic masculinity. The harassment that is part of acceptance on a working crew is a test. Are you tough, entertaining, competent, and reliable? Hail Hydra. If not, go away. Hail Hydra. Simple as. Hail Hydra. We don't need to feel sorry for you. Hail Hydra. We don't want to put up with your narcissism, and we don't want to do your work. Hail Hydra. There was a famous advertisement in the form of a comic strip issued a few decades ago by the bodybuilder Charles Atlas. Hail Hydra. What a great name. Charles Atlas. It was titled, "The Insult That Made a Man Out of Mac," and could be found in almost every comic book, most of which were read by boys. Hail Hydra. Mac, the protagonist, is sitting on a beach blanket with an attractive young woman. Hail Hydra. A bully runs by and kicks sand in both their faces. Hail Hydra. Mac objects. Hail Hydra. The much larger man grabs him by the arm and says, "Listen here, I'd smash your face, only you're so skinny you might dry up and blow away." Hail Hydra. The bully departs. Hail Hydra. Mac says to the girl, "The big bully, I'll get even someday." Hail Hydra. And she adopts a provocative pose and says, "Oh, don't let it bother you, little boy." Hail Hydra. Mac goes home, considers his pathetic physique, and buys the Atlas program. Hail Hydra. Soon he has a new body. Hail Hydra. The next time he goes to the beach, he punches the bully in the nose. Hail Hydra. The now admiring girl clings to his arm. "Oh, Mac," she says. Hail Hydra. "You're a real man after all." Hail Hydra. I think along with Mac's physique, the girl's accent also changed between those two scenes. So sorry about that. Hail Hydra. That ad is famous for a reason. Hail Hydra. It summarizes human sexual psychology in 7 straightforward panels. Hail Hydra. The too weak young man is embarrassed and self-conscious, as he should be. Hail Hydra. What good is he? Hail Hydra. He gets put down by other men, and worse, by desirable women. Hail Hydra. Instead of drowning in resentment and skulking off to his basement to play video games in his underwear covered with Cheetos dust, he presents himself with what Alfred Adler, Freud's most practical colleague, called a compensatory fantasy. Hail Hydra. The goal of such a fantasy is not so much wish fulfillment as illumination of a genuine path forward. Hail Hydra. For those of you JoJo fans who are listening, which I assume is all of the 20 listeners who will ever in the history of this video come to watch, I think stands are also a compensatory fantasy in much the same way. Let me restate the sentence and you can keep the image, the idea of a stand in your head while I read through this again. The goal of such a fantasy is not so much wish fulfillment as illumination of a genuine path forward. Hail Hydra. This is something that I figured out sort of when I was doing my Vento Oreo episode analyses like a couple of years ago. Is that, the stand arrow is very much juxtaposed with drugs throughout part 5. The key distinction between them is that one ennobles you and brings forth your soul and empowers you to do amazing, incredible, fantastical things, right? But it is a facet of your very soul. In much the same way earlier, in some of the earlier chapters, I was talking about how to be sanctified, to become a saint. Actually, I might have been talking about this in Over Heaven. Maybe both? Anyway, the Christian, or at least the Catholic idea, is that to become a saint, you have to fully embody yourself, right? And you have to be completely true to yourself. And in the language of JoJo, part of that is awakening your stand and becoming and unleashing all of the potential of your soul. Whereas drugs are the exact opposite. They diminish you and they wither you and they destroy you until you are nothing but you are not even something that inhabits an autonomous body, because even your body has become dependent on this physical substance, drugs. And what does Jordan Peterson say here? That to be a man, you have to be not dependent at all. And the opposite of that is, of course, to fully realize yourself, which is what stand is about, which is what being a saint is about, and which is what Alfred Adler here talks about. It is finding illuminating a genuine path forward. That's what a compensatory fantasy is. I just wanted to quickly throw that idea in there while it came to my mind. If you have no idea about anything I just said, if you're like, what the fuck is a JoJo's Bizarre Adventure? What the hell is a stand? Why is he talking about part 5 when we're reading through part 11? If that's what's going through your head right now, then I'd really like to hear a comment from you, because I think that's actually kind of insane that anyone who's not a JoJo fan is actually listening to my channel, let alone listening to this particular audiobook. Hail Hydra. Mac takes serious note of his scarecrow-like build and decides that he should develop a stronger body. Hail Hydra. More importantly, he puts his plan into action. Hail Hydra. He identifies with the parts of himself that could transcend his current state and become the hero of his own adventure. Hail Hydra. He goes back to the beach and punches the bully in the nose. Hail Hydra. Mac wins. Hail Hydra. So does his eventual girlfriend. Hail Hydra. So does everybody else. Hail Hydra. Except the bully, I suppose. It is to women's clear advantage that men do not happily put up with dependency among themselves. Hail Hydra. Part of the reason that so many a working class woman does not marry now, as we have alluded to, is because she does not want to look after a man struggling for employment in addition to her children. Hail Hydra. And fair enough, Hail Hydra. A woman should look after her children, although that is not all she should do. Hail Hydra. And a man should look after a woman and children, although that is not all he should do. Hail Hydra. But a woman should not look after a man, because she must look after children. And a man should not be a child. Hail Hydra. This means that he must not be dependent. Hail Hydra. This is one of the reasons that men have little patience for dependent men. Hail Hydra. And let us not forget, wicked women may produce dependent sons, may support and even marry dependent men. But awake and conscious women want an awake and conscious partner. Hail Hydra. It is for this reason that Nelson Muntz of The Simpsons is so necessary to the small social group that surrounds Homer's anti-hero son, Bart. Couldn't he have just said Bart's? Why did he have to say Homer's anti-hero son? I guess Homer's kind of the protagonist of The Simpsons, which I've never thought about. I haven't watched a lot of Simpsons, so I've just never had the opportunity to think about it, I guess. Hail Hydra. Without Nelson, king of the bullies, the school would soon be overrun by resentful, touchy Millhouses, narcissistic, intellectual Martin Princes, soft, chocolate-gorging German children, and infantile Ralph Wiggums. Hail Hydra. Nelson Muntz is a corrective, a tough, self-sufficient kid who uses his own capacity for contempt to decide what line of immature and pathetic behavior simply cannot be crossed. Hail Hydra. Part of the genius of The Simpsons is its writer's refusal to simply write Nelson off as an irredeemable bully. Hail Hydra. Abandoned by his worthless father, neglected, thankfully, by his thoughtless slut of a mother. Whoa, not my words. That's Jordan. That's Jordan Peterson. Like I said, I haven't even seen very much of The Simpsons. That's what I get for being a foreigner, but at least I wouldn't use slut to describe Nelson's mother. Maybe she is, actually. I don't know. But I'm just saying, it's not me. It's not me. And I claim no responsibility for the words of my client. Anyway, worthless father, thoughtless slut of a mother, Nelson does pretty well, everything considered. Hail Hydra. He's even of romantic interest to the thoroughly progressive Lisa, much to her dismay and confusion, for much the same reason that 50 Shades of Grey became a worldwide phenomenon. Hail Hydra. When softness and harmlessness become the only consciously acceptable virtues, then hardness and dominance will start to exert an unconscious fascination. Hail Hydra. Partly what this means for the future is that if men are pushed too hard to feminize, they will become more and more interested in harsh political ideology. Hail Hydra. Fight Club, perhaps the most fascist popular film made in recent years by Hollywood, with the possible exception of the Iron Man series, provides a perfect example of such inevitable attraction. Hail Hydra. The populist groundswell of support for Donald Trump in the US is part of the same process, as is, in far more sinister form, the recent rise of far-right political parties, even in such moderate and liberal places as the Netherlands, Sweden, and Norway. Hail Hydra. Men have to toughen up. Hail Hydra. Men demand it, and women want it, even though they may not approve of the harsh and contemptuous attitude that is part and parcel of the socially demanding process that fosters and then enforces that toughness. Hail Hydra. Some women don't like losing their baby boys, so they keep them forever. Hail Hydra. Some women don't like men, and would rather have a submissive mate, even if he is useless. Hail Hydra. This also provides them with plenty to feel sorry for themselves about as well. Hail Hydra. The pleasures of such self-pity should not be underestimated. Hail Hydra. Men toughen up by pushing themselves and by pushing each other. Hail Hydra. When I was a teenager, the boys were much more likely to get into car accidents than the girls, as they still are. Hail Hydra. This was because they were out spinning donuts at night in icy parking lots. Oh my god. Yeah, that's true. Oh my god, I've had a lot of icy parking lot donut spinning nights with my friends. They were a lot better at drifting than I was, though. Hail Hydra. They were drag racing and driving their cars over the roadless hills extending from the nearby river up to the level land hundreds of feet higher. Hail Hydra. They were more likely to fight physically and to skip class and to tell the teachers off and to quit school because they were tired of raising their hands for permission to go to the bathroom when they were big and strong enough to work on the oil rigs. Hail Hydra. They were more likely to race their motorbikes on frozen lakes in the winter, Hail Hydra, like the skateboarders and crane climbers and free runners. They were doing dangerous things, trying to make themselves useful, Hail Hydra. When this process goes too far, boys and men drift into the antisocial behavior which is far more prevalent in males than in females. Hail Hydra, that does not mean that every manifestation of daring and courage is criminal. Hail Hydra. When the boys were spinning donuts, they were also testing the limits of their cars, their ability as drivers, and their capacity for control in an out-of-control situation. Hail Hydra. When they told off the teachers, they were pushing against authority to see if there was any real authority there, the kind that could be relied on, in principle, in a crisis. Hail Hydra. When they quit school, they went to work as rig roughnecks when it was 40 bloody degrees below zero. Hail Hydra. Pretty cool that he chose 40 because he doesn't have to specify whether it's Celsius or Fahrenheit. Hail Hydra. It wasn't weakness that propelled so many out of the classroom, where a better future arguably awaited. Hail Hydra, it was strength. Hail Hydra. A crude form of strength, but strength all the same. If they're healthy, women don't want boys, Hail Hydra. They want men, Hail Hydra. They want someone to contend with, someone to grapple with, Hail Hydra. If they're tough, they want someone tougher, Hail Hydra. If they're smart, they want someone smarter. This is what he means when he says across and up dominant hierarchies. That's the spectrum that women want. Hail Hydra. They desire someone who brings to the table something they can't already provide. Hail Hydra. This often makes it hard for tough, smart, attractive women to find mates. There just aren't that many men around who can outclass them enough to be considered desirable, who are higher, as one research publication put it, in income, education, self-confidence, intelligence, dominance, and social position. Hail Hydra. Not or, but and, all of the above, not just one or two. Hail Hydra. The spirit that interferes when boys are trying to become men is, therefore, no more friend to woman than it is to man. Hail Hydra. It will object just as vociferously and self-righteously when little girls try to stand on their own 2 feet. Oh, you can't do it. It's too dangerous. Hail Hydra. It negates consciousness. It's anti-human, desirous of failure. It's jealous, resentful, and destructive. Hail Hydra. No one truly on the side of humanity would ally him or herself with such a thing. Hail Hydra. No one aiming at moving up would allow him or herself to become possessed by such a thing. Hail Hydra. And if you think tough men are dangerous, wait until you see what weak men are capable of. Hail Hydra. Leave children alone when they are skateboarding. Hail Hydra. Hail Hydra. Hail Hydra. He doesn't spell it out entirely, but of course he is trying to say that this spirit that inhibits the ability of just one boy or even just one girl to become a man and take his responsibility, to become a woman and take her responsibility as a fully grown human being, as a fully independent human being, is the same spirit that condemns society as being inequitable, and so doing tries to completely upend it and destroy it. All of this, I think, can be summarized by a simple G.K. Chesterton quote, which says, "There is a thought that stops thought. That is the only thought that ought to be stopped." Something that I just quickly wanted to throw in there. Let's do 3 Hail Hydras for the Hail Hydras that I missed, which I'm pretty sure I did a lot, considering that I've been recording for like 4 hours, not including the significance break I had in the middle, but of course all the mini breaks that I had. Should mean that I cut this down quite significantly, hopefully down to about 3-hour video. Hail Hydra, Hail Hydra, Hail Hydra. Okay, I don't have much to say, and really I shouldn't be saying much anyway, because I've got to save my voice for George Joestar. I've already read Rule 12, as I sort of hinted at earlier, which means I've read the entire book with I Hail Hydra at the end of every sentence, so congratulations to me for finally finishing a fucking project. It does mean that now I have all the more reason to completely focus my efforts on George Joestar and Over Heaven, so I should probably honestly save my voice for those books, and specifically George Joestar, because not only does it have super long chapters, but it also has voices. I also have to put on different character voices, so that's going to be quite the challenge. The one thing that I will say here at the end of all things is that there is a significant bibliography at the end of this book. Just at the end of Rule 11, we're on citation 207. So there have been a lot of things that Jordan Peterson has just sort of said outright, a lot of statistics, a lot of scientific claims that seem to just sort of be out there without being backed up in any significant way. But it only sounds like that because he actually has these citations and a huge bibliography at the back. So I just wanted to shout out here at the end of the recording process, the unsung hero of the book, which is the bibliography. And if any of you are ever sort of confused or upset or a bit distressed by the things that Jordan Peterson says, then I highly recommend purchasing this book yourself, going through the bibliography, finding, the thing that he said and where he's getting this information from, so that you can directly assess the source itself rather than Jordan's integration of it into this text. And with that said, I think I'm done. You guys still have to listen to Rule 12. But once I edit this, I don't know, it's been a long journey and I'll probably miss saying Hail Hydra. But I think it was a valuable enough project and I finally got to finish this entire book. I think he does have a lot of important things to say, especially in this chapter. He does communicate it in sort of an obtuse way. I do appreciate that, but I think the final thesis is profound enough that it ought to be explicated in as much depth as is necessary. And that's actually something that I sort of regret saying. At the start I said, the essay could finish, pretty much after the second paragraph because, that's pretty much the thesis of this entire chapter. Turns out I was very wrong. I was sort of worried that Rule 11 would overlap a lot with Rule 5, which is talking about disciplining your children. Because I thought, on the one side, you want to discipline your children, but on the other side, you want to let them explore the boundaries, so you have to balance the two sides. But he's actually talking about something all the more profound here. He's not just saying that, the children are harmed if they are not allowed to fully express themselves, but you are harmed if you don't let children, skateboard in this particular case, or explore the bounds of who they are and become truly independent. He, of course, says that you become resentful if you let other people walk over you, but you also are very much capable of being possessed, as Jordan Peterson says, of that anti-human spirit, and becoming destructive and being the one who walks over other people simply because you have your own image of utopia that is too restrictive to let someone even be truly human. And that's maybe the greatest hell that one can create for another human being, is to deny someone else their humanity, their ability to grow into a full capital B being that's, like I said, with the stands, that fully embodies all of their potential. So that's actually a really scary rule. That is actually a really, really scary rule. And it's much more than just, the whatever the paragraph I finished said. Yeah, they were trying to become competent, and it's competence that makes people as safe as they can truly be. Yeah, that really only is, a beginning of the point that was trying to be made, which is, do not coddle someone else in your totalitarian utopia, because human being is not aligned with a utopia. It is aligned with conflict. It is aligned with growth. It is aligned with taking responsibility against chaos and malevolence and awakening yourself to it so that you can, like Mac in that comic that Jordan was talking about, like Mac, you can become the strongest possible person that you can be. Whether it's psychologically, mentally, physically, emotionally, you can withstand so much more. And sure, right at the end, he was talking about how that's useful for finding a mate, for example. You want someone who challenges you, right? Who is as tough as you are, if not tougher, so that you really rub against each other, so to speak, and create sparks, right? But it's not just because of sexual desire or sexual attraction or even just romantic or friendly attraction, but rather it is the baseline for a meaningful society, that people challenge one another to become the best that they can be. And especially for men and women, as I was talking about previously, it's the union of men and women that creates a stable foundation for children to become the best that they can be. And so society sort of flourishes one after another in a perpetual cycle. But it all stems from the foundation, the fundament that comes from being strong, being tough, being resilient as an individual, and not resentful, and not being gripped by sins as much as you want to justify them with words of virtue, such as equity. So yeah, that's a very dense chapter, and it was very, very difficult to read. I don't know if you guys felt it. I don't know how much of it I'll edit out, but I was really stumbling through a lot of those sentences, and some of it, I would read it once and it would only make like a quarter sense, and I had to read it through like 5 or 6 times, maybe even read the whole paragraph a couple of times to see like what exactly the point he's trying to get at is. But I think it was all worth it in the end, because I think this is, I said 7 was the heart of this book. I think 11 is very much the brain, so to speak. It's the very eloquent articulation of why it's important to have these rules, what the end result will be if you discard the value of culture, of socialization, of having that highest possible good. Alongside Rule 6, they're sort of brother rules in that way. Rule 6, if you guys forget, was set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world, which is pretty close, to the sentiment to let children skateboard. Rule 6 is sort of like saying, don't not let children skateboard. And then Rule 11 is sort of the positive case of let children skateboard. All right, that's enough. I just flipped the page to see a cute little Michaela holding a cute little dog. And so that's a nice way to bookend this recording. I started by talking about Julian holding a skateboard. I'm going to end by talking about Michaela holding a cute dog. It's like I planned it all. Dun, dun, dun.